Fire swallowed the sky whole. Ancient stone pillars collapsed into the flames, and once splendid silks crumbled to ash. Standing before a disaster that could consume everything, Shin showed no fear at all. If anything, he spread his arms wide as if trying to embrace the chaos itself. What secret was this strange blaze really hiding? Anguished screams echoed all around. Countless figures, swallowed by the flames, turned their desperate eyes toward him as if demanding an answer. That was just one of the many nightmares that haunted him. The real story began a few days earlier, when a fake prince was sent to enemy territory in place of the real one. An 8-year-old child was about to face the Empire's most notoriously cold-blooded duke, all alone. The instant his identity was questioned, a sword left its sheath. In a performance that could cost him his life at any moment, he had to find a way to survive. The duke's welcoming banquet was about to begin, yet chaos had already broken out inside the palace. Word had it the duke's carriage had been delayed by a fire on the road, while the prince was already waiting in the guest hall. The steward was sweating buckets, terrified that the slightest mistake might slip through. Just as everyone was in a frenzy, a magnificent carriage finally pulled up before the palace. Duke Barcelona drew back the curtain and coldly surveyed the building before him. He knew perfectly well this trip would be anything but simple. The heavy doors slowly swung open. Under a sea of watching eyes, the main character finally made his entrance. To the sound of his name being announced, Duke Barcelona strode inside with his retainers at his back. His overwhelming presence swallowed the great hall in an instant. The 6th prince's nurse hurried forward and respectfully invited the duke out to the garden for tea. But Felix's expression never changed. He raised a hand to cut her off, stating flatly that he wanted to see Prince Xian right now. Crushed by his authority, the nurse could only lead the way with trembling steps. The whole walk there, she kept explaining that Prince Xian had been frail since childhood and had fallen ill just days ago, unable to greet him in person. Felix's face stayed cold as ice, and he said not a word until the nurse stopped before a closed door and murmured, "His Highness is inside." She gently pushed the door open and led the Duke in. Young Xian smiled and stepped forward, greeting Duke Barcelona with perfect courtesy. But one glance was all it took for Felix to sense something was wrong. Before the nurse could react, he drew his sword in a flash. Its cold blade pressed against Xian's throat, and the air in the room froze solid. The nurse cried out in panic, demanding to know why he'd drawn on the boy. Felix answered coldly. Did they really think he was stupid enough to be fooled? Toying with him even over the identity of a hostage? The nurse scrambled to defend herself, insisting this truly was Xian, delivered exactly as agreed. Felix recited the terms of the truce back at her. The hostage sent over was supposed to be a prince with violet eyes, and Xian should have been 8 years old by now. He looked at the frail child before him and gave a cold smile. What kind of 8-year-old looks like this? Not even close. The royal family was clearly treating them like fools. Stung by the challenge to his age, Xian panicked and insisted he really was 8, adding that his parents had both been late bloomers who shot up later in life. At once, the nurse's face went white and she quickly cut him off. Felix's eyes sharpened instantly. He'd caught the crack in the story. Everyone knew the Empress was small in stature, yet this child claimed his mother had grown taller later on. He was clearly lying. Looking at the telltale violet of Xian's eyes, Felix suspected the boy was an illegitimate child of the royal family. Moments later, he spotted something else suspicious. Felix suddenly asked the nurse about a stain on the hallway wall outside. The abrupt question caught her off guard. She struggled to stay composed, explaining that the wall was being reinforced before a new painting went up. Felix smiled coldly and tore the lie apart on the spot. Wasn't a portrait of the real prince hanging there before? The royal family had assumed that since Prince Xian had never appeared in public, simply hiding the portrait would fool everyone. What they hadn't known was that Felix had once secretly met the real prince. The lie was exposed right then and there. Felix had no patience left to waste words. He raised his sword at Xian and pronounced coldly, "There was only one path for an impostor to the throne." With the moment hanging by a thread, the nurse screamed in desperation that the royal family would never break its word. Felix paused. She hurried to explain that the Duke's only requirement had been a prince with violet eyes, and begged him to look closely at the child's. The nurse clutched Xian tight, insisting he truly possessed pure, genuine violet eyes. Staring into Sion's clear eyes, Felix fell silent for a moment. His retainer, however, only grew angrier, snapping that the nurse was splitting hairs. What they wanted was clearly the real Prince Sion. But then Felix unexpectedly sheathed his sword. No need for more words. They'd take the boy now. Before leaving, he coldly warned that he would absolutely track down the real prince's whereabouts. The nurse and Sion were left alone in the room, cold sweat soaking through their clothes. Once outside, Felix's anger hadn't cooled at all. He was certain that fair-haired child was nothing but an illegitimate offspring of the royal house. His retainer calmly reminded him the boy surely carried royal blood, and those violet eyes were the proof. Felix still hesitated, feeling the boy was far too young. The retainer replied flatly, "For someone about to die, does age even matter?" Felix had nothing left to say, and simply gave the order to prepare for the return to their territory. Back in the room, the nurse finally let out a breath of relief. She praised Sion for handling himself so well. Once the danger had passed, she said sternly that once they reached the Duke's territory, no matter how anyone tried to probe him, he had to keep playing the part, and never ever forget who he was supposed to be. Sion understood, and spoke up to reassure her. To make absolutely sure nothing went wrong, the nurse asked once more, quite seriously, "What is your Highness's name?" Sion looked her straight in the eye and answered slowly, word by word, "I am Sion Horta." The nurse repeated that he had to carve that name into his memory. From this moment on, he was the Empire's 6th prince, a hostage sent to enemy soil to put out the fires of war. Shin understood that this journey to the Duke's territory was, in every practical sense, a one-way trip. The instant a single flaw in his disguise showed, what waited for him would be a fate beyond saving. Sion jolted awake from that familiar nightmare, cold sweat soaking his clothes. By now, the carriage had crossed the border and officially entered Duke Barcelona's territory. Looking at the desolate land outside the window, Sion knew the real trial was only just beginning. As the carriage jolted along the rough mountain road, the nurse handed him a still steaming cup. Sion took a sip, and a brutal bitterness shot straight to his head. It turned out to be black coffee meant to keep him alert. Drinking it on an empty stomach was anything but pleasant. Before he could recover, the carriage suddenly lurched violently, followed by an urgent knock on the window. An attendant relayed Felix's order, demanding that Sion get out at once and meet him alone. The nurse tried to follow but was coldly stopped. Shin had no choice but to step down by himself. Felix walked briskly ahead, utterly indifferent to the fact that Sion was just a child. He had to grit his teeth and half-run just to keep up. Watching that cold, distant back, Sion knew this conversation was about to be anything but simple. Without turning around, Felix issued a chilling warning, "Don't even think about running." Sion suddenly stopped walking and said calmly that he had absolutely no intention of running. Felix looked a little surprised. Sion laid out the plain truth. He'd known about the secret pact between the royal family and the Duke long before this. Whatever happened to him here, the Empire would never intervene. From the very start, he had come here with no expectation of ever going back. Faced with Sion's calm acceptance, Felix's gaze cooled and pulled back. If he understood his own situation this well, there was nothing left to explain. Before Sion could even catch his breath, Felix stopped abruptly and gestured for him to look ahead. Following his hand, Sion froze in place. All that lay before him was a barren wasteland, silent in a way that felt deeply unsettling. Felix slowly recounted the past. This land once had rivers and green fields. But 300 years ago, the Empire's founding emperor cast down a curse upon it, turning it into ruins. To this day, the curse kept spreading and had nearly reached the Empire's own border. Shin looked at the tombstone-like markers used to mark the boundary, and a chill he couldn't put into words rose up inside him. Felix told him plainly that Xian was the sacrifice meant to break the curse. Who he really was didn't matter. It simply happened to be his turn this time. That said, if Xian had truly steeled himself to walk into death, the Duke's territory would pay a fair price in return. Xian found this bitterly ironic. Duke Barcelona was rumored to be bloodthirsty and cruel, and yet he still insisted on fairness in this exchange. But for someone already destined to die, what meaning could any reward possibly hold? Shin didn't beg. He simply apologized to Felix and calmly said he hoped his own death could truly put an end to all of this. By the time night fell, the carriage finally arrived at the castle. That marked the official start of Xian's life as a hostage. in a room so vast it felt hollow. Xian was still adjusting when the headmaid, Hilda, greeted him with startling warmth. Hilda took the lead and guided him to a secluded annex. Only family members were allowed to stay in the main castle, while this annex had long since been vacated and sealed shut. Complaining cheerfully about the territory's brutal weather, Hilda gave him a lively tour of everything around them. On the surface, Xian stayed composed, but suspicion was already stirring inside him. This headmaid seemed to be deliberately sending everyone else away, engineering a chance for the two of them to be alone. Hilda pointed to the one forest visible outside the window and revealed it was a miracle the Duke's late wife had created 5 years earlier. Then, lowering her voice, she told Xian an old story about Felix. Years ago, chasing after the woman he loved, the Duke had once kidnapped her in the dead of night. Xian could hardly believe it, that the cold, unfeeling Felix had ever been driven to such madness. To save this parched land, the Duke's wife had exhausted every last drop of her magic and had been asleep for 5 years since. That was also why Felix had slowly become so unhinged. Hearing these deep secrets of the territory, Xian's guard shot straight up to its highest level. He was just a hostage who could be killed at any moment. Why was this headmaid telling him things like this? What was she really after? Xin anxiously asked where the nurse was. Hilda told him not to worry. Then she slowly stepped closer, her voice dropping until it was barely a whisper. "Your Highness, don't you want to live?" The sudden question left Xian frozen in place. He even wondered if he'd misheard. Hilda said she could help him escape this place. Xian eyed the woman before him warily. Was she planning to betray the Duke? If the sacrifice fled, what would become of the curse on this land? Hilda's face stayed unsettlingly calm. Trading one life for another wouldn't solve anything anyway. What stunned Xian even more was Hilda openly declaring that her loyalty belonged only to the Duke's wife. What other secret was hiding behind all of this? Hilda insisted her lady was a kind woman who would never sacrifice an innocent child just to break a curse. Unfortunately, Felix, who actually held the power to decide, disagreed. Everything now rested entirely on Xian's choice. All he had to do was nod, and Hilda could guarantee his safe passage out of the territory. Standing before the one path to survival, Xian still hesitated. Was he afraid of dying? Xian stammered, trying to explain. But she saw right through him instantly. If he wasn't afraid of death, then what was he hesitating over? Looking at the young prince before her, Hilda's sharp instincts told her something was off. She left him with a piece of advice to think it over carefully, then turned and vanished into the darkness. Before Xian could even settle his racing thoughts, the nurse pushed the door open, visibly on guard. She pressed him about what Hilda had wanted. Xian, unwilling to reveal the escape plan, could only lie and say Hilda had simply been showing him the forest. Seeing Xian's pale face and dazed expression, worry filled the nurse's eyes. Xin used exhaustion from the long journey as an excuse to send her off to rest. The door slowly swung shut, leaving him alone in the room. Hilda's proposal had completely upended his plans. This one path to survival, should he take it or not? Alone in the empty room, Xian let out a quiet sigh. Hilda's parting question kept echoing in his mind. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the soft bed. In truth, the reason Xian hesitated was that he had long since accepted his fate to die. Behind the noble identity of the sixth prince, Xian Horta, traded away to buy peace, lay hidden a secret that could overturn everything. Xian was not the Empire's prince at all. That noble bloodline was nothing but a role she'd been paid to play. In truth, Xian was a professional actress. Her real age was 10, and on top of that she was a girl disguised as a boy. Not a single drop of royal blood ran through her. She was just an ordinary commoner child who happened to have violet eyes. Her true identity, buried even deeper, was even more dangerous. A convicted criminal awaiting execution. Her real name was Letitia. Before she'd earned that name, she was just a nameless orphan, struggling to survive on the streets, waiting to die. Who could have guessed that the Empire's noble prince was, in truth, an actress in disguise? Her age and her gender were both a lie. Even her violet eyes, so like the royal families, were nothing more than a coincidence of birth for an ordinary child. Hilda's question had dredged up Letitia's memories. Back then, she hadn't been a noble prince at all. Just an orphan scraping by on the streets for a bite to eat. Desperate to survive, she'd once stolen a loaf of bread, but luck wasn't on her side. and she was caught red-handed. The furious vendor grabbed her by the collar, beating and cursing her. Just as Letitia thought she couldn't take any more, a finely dressed man stepped in front of her. He casually tossed down a coin, buying her freedom from the vendor's grip. That mysterious man's arrival completely changed the course of Letitia's tragic life. At the glint of the shining coin, the vendor's face instantly twisted into a fawning smile. Once he had his money, he thanked the man over and over before scurrying off, leaving the girl alone with the nobleman. Seeing the man's lavish clothes and easy way with money, Letitia knew right away his status was anything but ordinary. In an orphan's understanding of the world, nobles were nothing but cruel, and she braced herself for another beating. But instead of raising a hand against her, the man studied her with a look full of meaning, and praised her as a girl with real, untapped talent. He crouched down and gently asked if she'd like to come with him. That single step would change the entire course of her life. Later, Letitia learned the man's name was Bonba, the head of the most famous theater troupe in the capital. He not only gave the homeless girl a place to eat and sleep, but went to great lengths to convince her to become an actress. At first, the timid child could barely speak without her voice shaking. But to survive, Letitia trained herself in acting as if her life depended on it. Who would have thought a former street beggar would one day shine on stage under thousands of watching eyes? The play on stage was building to its climax, and Letitia, playing an angel, was slowly lowered from above on a rope. Her stunning beauty left the entire audience in awe. Hearing the wave of applause rolling up from below, she once naively believed she possessed a rare gift. It wasn't until much later that Letitia learned a truth as bitter as it was absurd. What director Bonba had truly seen wasn't her acting at all. It was simply her beautiful face. Though that misunderstanding was equal parts funny and sad, for Letitia back then, having a roof over her head and shelter from the storm had already been an enormous act of salvation. Those carefree days had felt as perfect as a dream, but every dream eventually shatters. Special bulletins suddenly flooded the streets reporting a horrifying case that shook the entire country. The newspapers printed Letitia's face in plain sight, and in the blink of an eye, yesterday's angel had become today's demon in everyone's eyes. A sudden fire had burned the theater troupe to the ground. Bonba, the man who had saved and raised Letitia, died in that same fire. As the sole survivor, she was accused of arson and of causing everyone's deaths. The praise that had once come her way turned in an instant into vicious curses. From the center of attention, adored by thousands on stage, she plummeted overnight into a condemned criminal despised by the entire nation. Outside the prison, furious shouting never let up. The crowd demanded she be burned at the stake. Through the brutal interrogations, Letitia never said a word. Just as she calmly waited for death to come, a man of high standing appeared outside her cell. Looking down at her from above, he offered her an entirely new role. If she could play this part flawlessly, she would be cleared of her crimes and given a chance to live, and that new role was none other than a prince of the empire. To survive, Letitia had no right to refuse. All she could do was accept a mission that could cost her her life at any moment. Facing Hilda's relentless questioning, Cian's gaze slowly hardened with resolve. If she had accepted the role of prince, she would play it through to the very end of the show. As a professional actress who had already walked the line between life and death, once the curtain rose, she would never abandon the performance halfway through. Even if the price of this stage was her own life, she would still give everything she had to every single scene. In a performance built entirely on lies that could get her killed, could Cian keep the mask on and survive to the very end? Before long, Cian had been held in the Duke's territory for a full 3 days. Right now, she was facing a serious survival problem of her own. She was on the verge of starving. Even as a sacrifice, Cian was nominally still a guest of honor, and the Duke's household had made no attempt to skimp on her food. But no one had accounted for the one thing they'd overlooked: the punishing conditions of this land. The territory was desolate. The climate harsh, and fresh vegetables here were prized more than meat. So there was meat. Why wouldn't Cian eat it? For that, she really only had herself to blame. To hide her true identity, she'd been forced to starve herself nearly to the point of self-harm. The real prince was only 8, while Letitia was already 10. To avoid getting caught, she'd had to keep her body thin and small. The result, after so long, was a stomach ruined beyond repair, unable to handle rich, oily meat anymore. Worse still, the Duke's household only sent over raw ingredients that couldn't be eaten right away, with no one around to cook them. In everyone else's eyes, Xian was just a sacrifice waiting for her day to come. Aside from the nurse and the maid Aina, she had no one else beside her. The nurse was a noblewoman who had never once set foot in a kitchen, so the burden of cooking naturally fell on Aina, a maid who was only 16. That day, Aina cheerfully brought over a pot of meat stew swimming in fat. The dish immediately put Xian in a tight spot. Aina was no professional cook and had no idea Xian had been starving for so long. The moment one mouthful of the rich, greasy broth went down, Xian's stomach revolted violently. Aina went pale with fright, bowing over and over in apology, blaming her own poor cooking. Xian could only force a smile and comfort her. But in truth, for 3 whole days she'd survived on nothing but thin rice porridge, hungry to the point of barely being able to walk. Lunch was still a long way off, and her stomach kept growling nonstop. Right as she was about to break, Xian spotted a tree in full bloom with acacia flowers. An idea instantly sparked in her mind. Could these flowers be eaten? Even if they couldn't fill her stomach, just a taste of the sweet nectar inside might be enough to help her get by. Xian carefully picked a blossom and brought it to her lips to taste the nectar. A clean sweetness spread through her, and her whole body felt like it had come back to life. She could barely remember the last time she'd eaten a normal meal. That tiny bit of nectar felt like nothing less than a lifeline. But the joy didn't last long before a voice cold as ice spoke up from behind her. "Grazing on grass now, are we?" Xian jumped violently. Her hand trembling so hard the flower fell to the ground. She spun around on guard. A young man stood behind her, holding a lantern. Beside him was a massive, beastly white wolf. The young man looked at Xian with open disdain and sneered. "So this is how the Empire raises its princes, like livestock?" A noble prince, caught red-handed sneaking sips of nectar in the back garden by the young master of the Duke's household himself. The air turned suffocating in an instant. Xian looked at the young man before her, mind already racing to defend herself. His hair was the same color as Felix's, his face refined, his clothes fine, and he moved freely through the castle in the middle of the night. There was no need to guess further. This could only be Yamuka, the young master of Barcelona's territory. Xian hadn't expected to run into him of all people at a time like this. What puzzled her even more was the beastly white wolf at his side. Hilda had never once mentioned that the household kept such an unusual creature. Xian took a deep breath and greeted the young master first. Yamuka's face darkened, and he muttered coldly. Typical of the Horta family, his voice dripped with contempt and disgust. Looking down at her from above, Yamuka asked if she was by any chance hungry, then handed her a small bag. But what was inside was nothing meant for human consumption. It was a treat used to reward dogs. Yamuka added a cruel little jab. "Looking at you, a dog probably couldn't even tell you apart from itself. This suits you just fine." Then he raised an even more outrageous demand. If Xian crawled over to him like a dog, Yamuka would reward her with the bag of food. Xian froze. This guy was clearly out to start trouble, but on second thought, the Duke's household and the royal family were locked in bitter rivalry. It was hardly surprising the other side wasn't showing her kindness. Forcing a noble prince to crawl like a dog, Yamuka probably wanted to see her lose her temper, break down, or burst into humiliated tears. Going along with him was, honestly, the fastest way to avoid trouble. But Xian still had no idea where she'd offended this young master. From the moment she'd set foot here, everyone had treated her as good as dead already. Everyone probed and humiliated her as they pleased, and not a single soul actually cared how she felt. Fine, Xian would play along all the way. She bent down, pressing both hands onto the icy ground. Yamuka could never have guessed the prince before him was a complete fraud. Once upon a time, to survive, Letitia had rummaged through garbage bins. Crawling a few steps was nothing at all. Xian didn't just lower herself to the ground, she even let out a convincing bark. The stunt left Yamuka utterly at a loss for how to react. He couldn't fathom that an actual prince would truly crawl on all fours. Xian, meanwhile, couldn't care less. A dog couldn't talk anyway. As long as it got her what she wanted, a few extra barks cost her nothing. Watching Xian keep crawling forward, Yamuka finally genuinely panicked. He snapped angrily. Does the Horta family have no self-respect at all? Do you not even know the meaning of shame? Before Yamuka could finish, Cian had already lunged in close and bit down on the bag in his hand. She chewed it experimentally, a bit salty, but at least it was edible. This time it was Yamuka who completely fell apart. He pointed at Cian for a long while without being able to say a word, feeling that the person in front of him was, without a doubt, insane. Cian, meanwhile, chewed on the dog treat, thinking the taste wasn't actually half bad. She was just about to eat a few more bites when she suddenly let out a cry of pain and collapsed to the ground. The sudden collapse scared Yamuka out of his wits. He assumed the food had caused something serious, and immediately fled with the white wolf in tow. Watching his figure vanish in a frantic rush, Shin only then calmly sat back up and dusted herself off. There was no denying it, and her professional acting skills really did come in handy. She gently sent the difficult young master running off in fright. Yamuka ran the white wolf all the way back to the castle in one breath, still clutching the jerky he'd grabbed earlier. This time he'd learned his lesson. He wouldn't casually feed his food to just anyone again, to avoid a repeat of what had just happened. The moment he appeared, Yamuka ran straight into a manservant heading his way. The servant asked anxiously where he'd run off to in the middle of the night. Yamuka admitted honestly that he'd gone to the forest. Hearing the answer, the servant was stunned. How could he just walk into such a dangerous forest on a whim? And why had the young master kept taking the white wolf out lately? Yamuka offered no explanation, his mind still replaying the strange prince's bizarre behavior over and over. Watching the young master lost in thought, the servant grew worried, having no idea what had gotten into him these days. The servant warned him that if the Duke found out, the consequences would be severe. Yamuka couldn't have cared less, and even bluntly told him to go tell on him if he wanted. The young master figured that locking him up in his mother's old quarters was really all it would take to turn him into an obedient, model heir. That was nothing but a pipe dream. Left speechless, the servant had no idea what else to say. Right then, Felix called out to Yamuka and asked if he'd just come from the Forbidden Forest. Yamuka calmly admitted he'd only walked around the edge of it. That was because Cian, the sacrifice sent from the Empire, was currently staying in the forest ranger's cabin. Yamuka let out a cold snort, thoroughly disgusted by the thing that had been delivered right to their doorstep. Convinced that bringing home such a useless creature was nothing but a waste of food, Felix sternly warned that the territory's curse was about to be broken. Until Astrid woke up, Yamuka was absolutely forbidden from bringing his brother out of the tower. At the mention of the word brother, Yamuka only laughed coldly. I don't have a brother. Felix called his son by his full name, his voice growing cold. Did he really think killing off one frail little prince would solve everything? Yamuka refused to back down. Stop lying to yourself, father. Mother doesn't have much time left. Once she's gone from this world, this land will never see rain again. He even added a bitter jab. Not that it matters. You stopped caring about her long ago anyway. The words struck a raw nerve. Felix fell silent at once, standing there, his face draining pale. Yamuka said nothing more, ordering the servant to take the white wolf back. But the image of Cian's strange behavior in the forest kept replaying in his mind, refusing to let his mood settle. It wasn't until the white wolf nuzzled up against him that Yamuka finally came back to himself. He gently stroked its white fur, and for once a rare trace of warmth crossed his usually ice-cold face. Before long, it was already noon the next day, and a banquet was being prepared in the castle. The dining hall's atmosphere was so heavy it felt almost suffocating. Felix sat at the head of the table, cutting his meat with his head bowed, never once looking up. Yamuka sat beside him, equally silent. The only sound in the great hall was the cold clink of knives and forks. Shin gripped her spoon tightly, sitting frozen in her chair. This meal felt more unbearable than being interrogated. For a full 20 minutes, father and son didn't exchange a single word. Shin had meant to act as if nothing were wrong, but the bizarrely oppressive silence was truly more than she could stand. Looking at the table piled with glistening roasted meat, her stomach churned violently. She even began to suspect this family was deliberately fattening her up before the day of the sacrifice. Just as Cian was still hesitating, Yamuka, sitting across from her, let out a quiet sigh. For a moment, a complicated emotion flickered across his eyes. Felix suddenly spoke up. Why aren't you using your knife and fork? Shin could only lie awkwardly, using the long carriage ride as an excuse for her still unsettled stomach. Hearing the clumsy excuse, Yamuka couldn't help muttering under his breath. All he could picture was this same person stealing the wolf's food in the forest just yesterday. Felix let out a quiet sigh upon hearing this, saying that if he'd known, he wouldn't have invited Cian to dine with them at all. Cian quickly offered a polite word of thanks. Felix didn't push the matter further, waving a hand to let Cian go rest. The unexpected leniency left Cian baffled. The Duke, supposedly cold and heartless by reputation, could he actually be showing some concern for her? Looking at Felix before her, Cian suddenly felt he wasn't nearly as terrifying as the rumors claimed. Now that she'd been given leave, Cian naturally didn't want to linger. She stood, thanked him, and turned to excuse herself. But before she could finish speaking, the heavy dining room doors were violently shoved open from outside. Chaotic shouts of protest rang out beyond the doors, servants frantically begging some visitor not to act rashly. Shin froze at the sudden commotion. Before anyone could react, a massive black-gloved hand had already seized the doorframe. The doors swung fully open. The one who stormed in was none other than the former Duke, Jennang. The moment he entered, he let out an excited roar. So the sacrifice has finally arrived. Before anyone could recover, Jen's face darkened and he marched straight toward Cian. The attendants behind him scrambled after him in a panic, shouting for him to stop, but there was no holding him back. Before Cian could even make sense of what was happening, Jen had already grabbed her and hoisted her into the air. The sudden violence left her mind blank. Jen gave Cian no chance to resist, slinging her over his shoulder and striding straight out of the dining hall. Yamuka rushed to stop him but was no match at all for his own grandfather. In desperation, all he could do was shout at the top of his lungs, "If you don't stop, I'm telling Grandma." Strangely enough, at the mention of telling Grandma, Jen, who had been unstoppable moments before, actually froze mid-stride. He paused only for an instant, then, paying no more attention to the shouting behind him, took off running with Cian at breakneck speed. Yamuka chased after them with everything he had, gasping for breath, but all he could do was watch helplessly as the two of them disappeared from view. Not long after, Jen brought Cian to a desolate stretch of countryside. Looking at the eerily lifeless surroundings, Cian silently despaired, half convinced this would be the day she died, but she quickly forced herself to stay calm. Recalling Yamuka's earlier panic, Cian realized at once that this reckless act of Jen's had absolutely not been part of the plan. What's more, Yamuka had called this man grandfather, so the imposing man before her had to be none other than the former Duke, Jennang. Shin's mind raced through the calculations. If this was purely the former Duke acting on his own, then even if something went wrong, the fault would fall on House Barcelona. After all, she was only a stand-in meant for sacrifice. Whether she lived or died had never really mattered. She just hadn't expected danger to close in this fast. Right then, Jen suddenly seized hold of Cian. Before the ritual could begin, he had to confirm whether she was truly the right person for it. Cian froze, unsure what being the right person even meant. Jen's expression never changed. If they used the wrong person, everything would be meaningless. He raised his black-gloved hand, revealing a withered leaf. Jen explained this leaf had been grown from sacred ground. The instant it left the lake's territory, it would wither away. He declared coldly that if she truly was the sacrifice, she would have to break the curse held within this leaf. Cian panicked instantly. She hadn't expected there to be a test before the ritual even began. If she failed, her disguise as a fake prince would be exposed on the spot. But Jen gave her no room to back away. He forced her outright to prove she could work the miracle that might save this land. In truth, Cian had long since accepted there was no path to survival for her either way. Even the real prince had been sent here to be sacrificed. If her false identity were exposed now, she'd have even less chance of escaping that same fate. If she were found out as an imposter, she could never talk her way out of the punishment. From the very moment she'd climbed into that carriage, Shin had never expected to survive and return. But what worried her most right now wasn't her own life. It was the deal she had signed before all of this began. The other party had promised that as long as she played the sacrifice obediently, they would spare her family. If her identity were exposed right now, the survivors would lose any chance of being saved. Back in that dark cell, Letitia's wrists had been bound in heavy iron chains. She desperately asked the person outside whether her family was still alive. The answer she got back was merciless. most of them hadn't made it. The rest were badly wounded, and without treatment soon, they wouldn't hold on much longer. That was exactly the leverage the other side used to force her compliance. The high and mighty prince had extended his hand and laid down a single condition. All she had to do was go in his place, and the survivors would be treated immediately. Staring at the bars in front of her, Letitia had no right at all to refuse. For the sake of her family's lives, she could only grit her teeth and accept the trade. Letitia had furiously protested that he knew perfectly well she hadn't burned the theater troupe down. If she were truly a cold-blooded monster, why would he even bother using her family's lives as leverage to strike this deal? In the end, all these people wanted was someone to take the blame in their place. And she just happened to have the violet eyes they needed. Even knowing she'd been framed, Letitia had no other road left to take. In her memory, her little sister had once said goodbye to her, over and over, hugging a single sunflower and beaming with a bright smile. To protect her family's lives, Letitia could only give in. As long as it saved them, she was willing to play the role of the sacrifice in someone else's place. That was her one and only hope. But if she died for nothing, her family still wouldn't be saved, and everything would have been for nothing. Just as Cian sank into despair, the withered leaf drifted down onto her head. The very next second, a miracle happened. The leaf, once completely lifeless, burst into a blinding blue glow before returning to full, vibrant green. Even Jen, who had been standing by waiting to watch her fail, was left utterly stunned. Staring at the leaf that had turned green again above her head, Cian went blank, unable to grasp what had just happened. Jen suddenly burst into loud laughter. It seemed this time Felix really had brought back a sacrifice that met the requirements. Watching his excitement, Cian felt nothing but dread rising inside her. Before she could even react, Jen tightened his grip on her. Now that her identity was confirmed, there was no need to hesitate any longer. He would remember her sacrifice well. The moment the words left his mouth, Jen struck. Cian had no way left to escape. Facing a blow from Jen that could end everything, she squeezed her eyes shut in fear, certain that this time there was truly no escape. At the critical instant, Felix appeared out of nowhere and blocked the blow just in time. If Father acted rashly for a moment, killing her wouldn't solve anything. Jen clicked his tongue in irritation, but finally stayed his hand. Your reflexes were quick this time. Cian's small life had been spared for now. But what came next was hardly promising. Felix answered coldly, if he turned out just like his father, what kind of man would that make him? Jen's face darkened. I can't afford to wait even one more day. Felix raised his voice. This decision is far too reckless. What if it fails? The longer we wait, the worse it gets. The lake is shrinking by the day. Felix forced himself to stay calm. I'm searching for a new water source. Only once everything is properly prepared can we be sure nothing goes wrong. There's no time left. If this frail little prince escapes, we lose our chance completely. Listening to the two of them argue, Cian, hidden behind them, could only stay silent. Her situation was far more dangerous than she'd imagined. Shin's mind spun in confusion. She couldn't understand why the test had succeeded. Could she really be an illegitimate child of the Emperor? But Cian dismissed the thought immediately. That was far too absurd. A woman's image suddenly rose in her mind. That figure gently comforted her. Don't be afraid. Leave it all to me. Before Cian could make sense of it, Felix spoke sternly. From here on, we have to be even more careful. We only get one chance. If anything goes wrong, Astrid will truly have no hope left. Jen answered coldly. What difference does Astrid's life make compared to the lives of millions across this land? I don't care whether she lives or dies. As long as the forest survives once she's gone, that's enough. At those cold words, Cian finally couldn't hold back any longer. She stared straight at Felix. Then just kill me right now. The moment she said it, Cian suddenly lunged forward and grabbed hold of Felix. But the instant she touched him, an unfamiliar stream of consciousness suddenly flooded into her mind. Cian's eyes changed. The smile on her lips no longer resembled her usual self, leaving Jen beside her stunned. While everyone was still struggling to understand what was happening, a voice that seemed to belong to someone else spoke through Cian's mouth, addressed to Felix. Felix, get a divorce, you jerk. The instant those words left her lips, Felix went completely still, unable to believe his own ears. Before anyone could react, Cian's body swayed as if she'd lost all strength. Watching her suddenly collapse into his arms, Felix panicked instantly. Jen beside him was equally stunned. utterly unprepared for this to happen. Amid the confusion, the air around them suddenly turned strange. A golden light gathered slowly around Xian. Her consciousness quickly dimmed and sank completely into darkness. When she opened her eyes again, the scenery around her had changed completely. Xian looked around in a daze. Why did this place look exactly like a theater's dressing room? She'd been standing by the lake just a moment ago, yet somehow she was here now, in the blink of an eye. Xian suspected she was dreaming, and what's more, a dream in which she still retained her own awareness. Just then, a mysterious woman stepped out from behind a curtain. "Hello there, little one." Xin had absolutely no idea how to respond. The woman before her was surrounded by white roses, radiating a nobility so striking that Xian couldn't compose herself for a moment. Before she could even speak, the woman suddenly pulled Xian into a tight embrace. So adorable. The sudden warmth left Xian frozen on the spot. Astrid looked at the child in her arms and praised her happily. "Such a pretty face. You really do look just like my own son." Xian felt lost, utterly unable to make sense of what was happening. Astrid added, with a hint of regret, that if her body were healthy, she'd genuinely want to take Xian on as her student. She'd assumed Xian was an actress from a theater troupe, never imagining the royal family had actually sent over a fake prince. Xian hesitated, then tried out the title. "Your Highness." Astrid smiled gently and pulled the child close. "I've already decided on the divorce, so I'm no one's Your Highness anymore. From now on, just call me Astrid." Looking at the gentle woman before her, Xian was momentarily lost in thought. Nervously, she corrected how she addressed her, then curiously asked if this was all a dream. Astrid smiled and explained that this was, in fact, the deepest layer of Xian's own consciousness. She'd simply dropped by for a quick look while passing through. Xian quickly asked if it was Astrid who had brought the withered leaf back to life earlier. Astrid shook her head, insisting she'd done absolutely nothing. That was your own power. Xin found it hard to believe. Could she really carry royal blood after all? Astrid denied it immediately. She said seriously that the power inside Xian went far beyond anything as simple as royal bloodline. This land had become a wasteland entirely because of the first emperor's curse. Xin mentioned that Felix had already told her quite a bit about it. Astrid sighed after hearing this, then revealed a secret even more shocking. While the curse truly had been left behind by the first emperor, relying on royal bloodline alone now did absolutely nothing. Xian pressed her anxiously. After all, everyone kept saying all it took was a member of the royal family as the sacrifice. Astrid explained helplessly. Back then, all I ever said was that they needed to find someone with violet eyes. Felix and everyone else simply assumed on their own that it meant someone of royal blood. Then she looked at Xian and revealed a truth even more staggering. "The truth is, it was I who called you here." Xian went completely blank. Astrid looked a little conflicted. Even though she was the one who'd set that condition, she'd never actually believed Felix could truly pull it off. It had felt like an impossible task. Even Astrid herself was curious how exactly Felix had managed to find Xian. Watching the complicated expression cross her face, Xian grew even more confused. Right then, Astrid gently took Xian's hand and told her a truth the girl could hardly believe. "You're just like me. You're a mage." Hearing that word, Xian froze completely. Astrid said with a smile that although Xian's power hadn't fully awakened yet, she could still sense an incredibly powerful source of magic within the child. This whole situation was getting more and more interesting. Astrid explained that the power inside Xian had tried to awaken before, but never fully succeeded. When the right moment came, it would open naturally on its own. There was also a more brutal method, using an opposing element to force it awake. Since both Xian and Astrid carried the water attribute, Astrid suggested brightly, "Why not try jumping into fire?" Hearing such a reckless idea, Xian froze in fear. Astrid quickly reassured her that an opposing element wouldn't easily take a mage's life. She also advised that if Xian's power never awakened on its own, she should try to seek out the mage tower. Astrid promised her own teacher was an extremely capable person who would surely accept Xian as a student. But what Xian actually cared about wasn't any of that. She hesitated, then asked if she really went to the mage tower, what would happen to this land? Could the mage tower help break the curse for everyone? At that question, Astrid suddenly fell silent. She said the mage tower always paid an enormous price to bring a mage back. Back when they'd taken Astrid, They hadn't just handed over 12 vaults of gold, but had actually carved an entire river through a desert. Cian's worth would certainly be no less than that, if not more. As long as the duchy asked, the Mage Tower could summon rain and build a lake here on the spot, but Cian quickly zeroed in on the real point. So that means the Mage Tower can't actually break the curse itself, right? Astrid didn't deny it. However, she said that wasn't something Cian needed to worry about. It was a problem the duchy would have to solve on its own. Shin couldn't simply pretend not to know, though. Tense, she gripped the edge of her clothes, remembering the withered leaf she'd once touched. Back then, the curse had genuinely been broken, and the leaf had come back to life. And beyond that, despite such impossibly strict conditions, Felix had still managed to find exactly the right person. A staggering thought suddenly surfaced in Cian's mind. Could it be that what this land truly needed wasn't royal bloodline at all, but her specifically? Hearing that guess, Astrid froze for a moment. Watching the smile on her face, Cian had no idea what to make of it. But Astrid's smile suddenly vanished, and she denied it firmly. It's not like that. An actress, the first time she receives a script, is always taught to control her physical reactions so her performance feels natural. A sudden change in breathing, repeated blinking, or licking dry lips. These are all the tells that slip out when someone lies. They're incredibly easy for others to catch. And right now, Astrid seemed to be deliberately using those very details to pass Cian a truth she was otherwise hiding. Shin asked, almost to herself. Does my death actually mean something? Hearing that, Astrid went completely still. When Cian's consciousness resurfaced once more, her mind was a tangled mess. She could only vaguely recall that in the final moment, Astrid had seemed to be trying with all her strength to tell her something. In the dream, the woman had been anxious, urgently warning her, over and over, never to do a certain thing. But no matter how hard Cian tried to listen, she could never quite make out the words. Drifting slowly back to consciousness, Cian discovered someone sitting beside the bed. She saw clearly it was Yamuka. Fear snapped her fully awake. Before Cian could even figure out where she was, she turned her head and found Yamuka sitting by the bed, watching her. The unfamiliar room left her disoriented. Suspicious, she realized. This wasn't Cian's room. Every curtain had been drawn shut tight, the room so dark she could barely see her own hand. Just as Cian reached to pull the curtain open, a hand shot out and stopped her instantly. Yamuka warned coldly, "Do not open that curtain under any circumstances, unless you want my father to deal with you on the spot." He tossed out a curt "follow me" before turning to lead the way. Despite her lingering doubts, Cian could only obediently trail behind, but her body was genuinely far too weak. She hadn't even taken 2 steps before she collapsed to the floor. Flustered, she explained she'd just lost her footing, but in truth, she barely had the strength left to stand back up on her own. Looking at the frail figure before him, Yamuka was full of doubt. He couldn't understand why his father would bring such a burden into the tower. But since things had already gone this far, Yamuka could only sigh in resignation. It seemed the road ahead was going to be even more trouble than he'd thought. As Cian stumbled along behind him, a long white cloak was suddenly draped over her head, covering her entire body. Before she could react, Yamuka explained flatly, "This isn't a place you're allowed to see. Your head needs to stay covered." Yamuka crouched down and ordered her, "Get on my back." Looking at the proud young master before her, Cian hesitated for a moment. Yamuka, running out of patience, urged her on, specifically telling her to keep her eyes shut and absolutely not look around. With no other option, Cian could only obediently climb on and let Yamuka carry her. In the quiet corridor, riding on Yamuka's back, Shin felt a twinge of guilt. She murmured a hesitant "thank you." "Thank you for helping me, young master." Hearing the title, Yamuka looked less than pleased. "Don't call me that from now on." The air instantly turned strange. The young man suddenly introduced himself. "I'm Yamuka. Just call me by my name from now on." Cian blinked, confused, and hesitantly agreed, though inwardly she couldn't help but wonder. This guy had clearly hated her not long ago. Why the sudden shift to friendliness? Calling someone by their first name was usually reserved for people who were close. Before Cian could puzzle it out any further, Yamuka suddenly asked, "Do you know my father plans to kill you?" Cian honestly admitted that she knew, though Felix hadn't specified when. It seemed that on this matter, Felix and Yamuka didn't quite see eye to eye. Yamuka said nothing more, simply continuing to carry Cian deeper into the darkness. A moment later, he remarked, almost helplessly, that Cian talked about her own death as if she were discussing someone else's business. Shin, for her part, remained entirely composed. She believed she was simply looking reality straight in the eye. Besides, as long as she cooperated, it would only make things easier on the Duke's side. After all, the whole point of the sacrifice was to break the curse on this land. Hearing this, Yamuka suddenly stopped and asked coldly, "Do you actually believe that nonsense?" Before Cian could respond, Yamuka bluntly said Hilda had long since insisted that using a royal family member as the sacrifice was entirely pointless. When it came to magic and curses, Hilda understood far more than his father ever would. Cian just gave a self-mocking smile. Even if the Duke was wrong, it hardly mattered. Whatever the outcome, neither he nor Yamuka would lose anything. She was the only one who'd pay the price. Carrying Cian on his back, Yamuka asked, puzzled, "Are you really not afraid of dying at all?" Cian asked in return whether Yamuka was deliberately trying to scare her. Yamuka explained that he simply found Cian's reaction far too strange. A sacrifice trying to escape would obviously cause endless trouble. But the way Cian was acting right now made it look like she actually wanted to die. Hearing this, Cian silently denied it to herself. How could that possibly be true? After returning to her room, Cian said she wanted some time alone. Hilda still wasn't at ease. She asked if it was really safe to leave His Highness alone without any guards nearby. The nurse cut in coldly at once. If His Highness himself said he was fine, then Hilda dragging this out would only tire him out further. Hilda shot back immediately, insisting she cared nothing at all about Cian's safety. The nurse then pointedly brought up the earlier incident, when guards had clearly been present, and yet trouble had still found its way in. Hilda's expression changed instantly. She was just about to ask if the nurse was accusing the guard unit outright when the two nearly came to blows. Right then, Cian spoke up to stop them. She stepped forward and reassured Hilda directly, insisting she really was fine and telling her not to worry so much. The tension finally eased. Sitting alone by the window, Cian's mind was full of thoughts about Astrid. She couldn't help wondering whether Astrid could really bring herself to watch this land wither away completely. Maybe Astrid simply didn't know. Cian couldn't bear to watch an innocent child be sent off to sacrifice, which was probably why she'd urged her toward the Mage Tower. But deep down, Astrid surely couldn't let go of her family either. The curse on this land didn't just ruin the soil. It took its toll on the people living here too. The descendants of House Barcelona had all been slowly losing their emotions. When Yamuka had first told her this, Cian had asked in astonishment, "Is that also part of the curse?" Yamuka confirmed that it was. Cian had once thought Yamuka wasn't cold-blooded at all, but the young man had coldly said that was only because he was still young. Over time, the curse's power would only grow stronger, until it stripped them of every last bit of feeling. Yamuka said bluntly that his father and grandfather had long since lost nearly all of their emotions. Cian, confused, asked why he was suddenly telling her all this. Yamuka laid his position out plainly. "I just want you to understand. Don't expect any mercy from this family. In the eyes of the Barcelona elders, sacrifice was the only way to save this land. Even if it ultimately failed, they would simply conclude they'd run out of options. They wouldn't feel the slightest guilt over Cian's death." Those words made Cian fully grasp what lay ahead. Yamuka coldly warned her, "If you don't want to die for nothing, you'd better be smarter about this." Even though his words were far from comforting, Cian could still sense that Yamuka cared in his own way. But knowing these secrets did nothing to change her circumstances. She was still the one being led to the altar. Cian sat alone by the window, watching the night outside with a heart full of turmoil. At first, she'd assumed she was simply an innocent child, dragged here for no reason at all to wait for death. Now she knew her sacrifice might actually save this parched, dying land. Thinking about it, Cian gave a self-mocking smile. Maybe this really was a fate she could never escape. It turned out her violet eyes had only ever been a marker used to find a mage. What this land truly needed was the life of someone with magic. Now that she knew the conditions for her power to awaken, Cian began forming a plan of her own. Right at that moment, Jen unexpectedly climbed a rope and swung through her window into the room. Before he could even say a word, Xian had already stepped forward on her own. Seeing Jen climb in through the window, she showed no fear at all. Instead, she said calmly, "I've been waiting a long time for you." The reaction caught Jen a little off guard. Seeing Xian go along so willingly, he couldn't be bothered to explain further and simply moved to take her away at once. But before he could act, Shin made a request. She looked at Jen and asked seriously, "Could you set me on fire?" Seeing the utterly serious look on Xian's face, Jen went blank. He even wondered if he'd misheard. After a long pause, he finally asked, "What did you just say?" Meanwhile, Felix was in his study, working through paperwork. He casually asked his retainer about his father's whereabouts. The man beside him immediately started stammering, unable to string together a single complete sentence for a long moment. Because right at that moment, the servants throughout the castle were nearly in a state of panic. Jen, a man normally cold enough to terrify anyone, was currently cradling the young prince in his arms, strolling brazenly through the entire castle. Felix sighed with a headache and asked how many days this doting behavior towards Xian had already been going on. The retainer answered honestly, "Counting today, it's been 4 days. And His Highness's nurse has been crying nonstop the whole time, terrified something might happen to the frail prince." Felix, for once, had nothing to say. The retainer gently offered some comfort, pointing out that at least Jen was currently just caring for Xian, which meant he'd temporarily given up on the idea of harming her. Out in the corridor, Jen looked over Xian's clothes and scoffed, ordering the maids to throw out all the coarse fabric and use only the finest cotton to make Xian a brand new outfit. The retainer couldn't help feeling that having Jen look after a child didn't seem like a problem at all. Felix, however, asked coldly, "Have you forgotten the reason my father got divorced in the first place?" That single question instantly pulled his memory back 5 years. Back then, the castle maids used to whisper among themselves. Word had it the former duke's wife had suffered a terrible ordeal while pregnant with her second child. The baby hadn't survived, and the father had vanished from the castle entirely. It seemed an even crueler secret lay hidden behind all of it. Asana, the former duke's wife, had once been deeply cherished by everyone. But during a family meal, Jen had coldly said to Felix, right in front of his own wife, "If your mother can't carry a second child, I'll simply find another woman to bear one for me." Hearing her husband's callous words, Asana furiously smashed her cup right there on the spot, screaming that Jen was unfit to even call himself human. After hurling a silver plate at him as well, Asana immediately packed her bags and returned to her parents' home. The very next day, she sent over divorce papers. But Jen was stubborn and adamant, refusing to sign. Seeing this, Felix had thrown his own father into the dungeon, forged his signature on the papers himself, and forced the marriage to a close. And yet here he was now, that same cold-hearted father, personally doting on Prince Xian. Hearing this ridiculous story about Jen's past, the retainer could only laugh bitterly. Just as the two of them were talking, a scattered trail of dried meat appeared along the corridor floor. Xian walked past and casually gathered every last piece into her bag. The scene happened to be witnessed by both Felix and the retainer. The two of them froze, faces full of confusion. Felix truly couldn't stand to watch anymore. He stepped forward and warned Xian never to pick up dirty things off the ground again. Shin was just about to move on when she ran straight into Jen, his face already darkening. Jen asked where she'd just been. Shin answered honestly that she'd gone to the study to confirm something. He told her to throw away every dirty scrap in her bag and promised he'd have proper food prepared for her from now on. Back in his room, Jen personally handed Xian a piece of chocolate, sternly telling her never again to eat anything picked up off the ground. A little hurt, Shin quietly explained that she hadn't actually planned on eating that jerky. She'd only wanted to give it to the white wolf sleeping nearby. Shin guessed the meat had been deliberately scattered along the path by Yamuka to lure the wolf into following him. Hearing her clear reasoning, Jen couldn't help but praise Xian for being remarkably sharp. Then, he steered the conversation back to the matter at hand. Jen asked seriously whether Xian truly wanted to jump into fire to test if she was really a mage. He understood full well that the power she'd shown that day couldn't possibly belong to an ordinary young prince. But he absolutely could not let Xian act recklessly. She was the only sacrifice with any real hope of breaking the curse. If fire reduced her to ash, the entire plan would fall apart. Jen said coldly that the only proven way to break the curse was to submerge the sacrifice underwater. Since the path of fire couldn't be taken, Shin reluctantly gave in and looked for another way. Jen suddenly took Cian's hand and placed it directly on the white wolf's body. Bracing for something dangerous, Cian could only bring herself to gently stroke its fur. To her surprise, the fierce wolf not only didn't resist, but showed her nothing but affection. Satisfied, Jen stepped back on his own. "Go on, play with it for a while. That's really all you need to do." Cian had braced herself for some grueling ordeal, so for a moment she didn't know how to react. She stepped forward on her own, greeted the white wolf warmly, and complimented its beautiful eyes. At first it was perfectly gentle, even affectionately licking Cian's face until she burst into giggles. But right in the middle of that peaceful moment, the wolf's eyes suddenly turned savage. Sensing something was wrong, Jen shouted for Cian to get out of the way. Before Cian could react, the wolf had already opened its jaws wide and lunged straight at her. The blue-eyed beast Yamuka usually kept by his side was named Tan. Throughout the entire ducal household, no one dared treat it as an ordinary animal. Even the servants kept a respectful distance whenever they crossed paths with it. What made Tan special wasn't just its noble appearance. Though it couldn't cast magic itself, it could actually sniff out hidden power. Quietly observing the white wolf, Jen realized the magical response coming from Tan was extraordinarily strong. Power by nature was drawn toward a greater source of power. The fact that Tan had grown so affectionate towards Cian proved the power within her was anything but ordinary. Jen found his thoughts drifting without meaning to toward Astrid, still deep in her endless sleep. If Cian's magic wasn't strong enough, the fate waiting for her might well turn out just as tragic as Astrid's. If this child had no magical talent at all, her identity as prince would carry no leverage worth exploiting. To confirm once and for all whether Cian truly held that power, Jen suddenly barked an order for Tan to attack. Tan lunged straight at Cian while she stood there completely unguarded. But right at the critical moment, everything changed in an instant. Jen's face went pale, and he shouted urgently for Tan to stop. Thankfully, Felix arrived just in time and swept Cian out of harm's way. Furious, he demanded an explanation. "Have you lost your mind, father? Using a beast to attack the Empire's own prince?" Jen calmly insisted it had only been a test. Felix didn't believe a word of it. If I'd arrived even a moment later, she would already be dead. Jen still refused to back down, accusing his son of meddling in matters that were none of his concern. Watching father and son argue fiercely in the corridor, the retainer standing nearby could only feel utterly helpless. Felix had no patience left to waste words. He stepped directly in front of Cian to shield her, and declared that from this day on, he would protect the prince himself. Jen was about to object when Felix cut him off coldly. "Don't forget, father, I'm the head of this family now." Felix then summoned the guards and forced his father away. This time, Jen had truly hit a wall he couldn't push through. His own son had him locked away in the 7th dungeon deep underground. To prevent any further incidents, Felix ordered Cian moved to the most luxurious room in the main residence. Watching everyone scramble to make it happen, Hilda was consumed with guilt. She apologized to Cian on her own, admitting she felt she hadn't protected her carefully enough. Hilda's eyes, looking at the fragile young prince, were filled with worry. She gently reassured her that with Felix protecting her now, there was nothing left to fear. Cian, still uneasy, asked instead what had happened to Jen. Hilda sighed. "He's been locked in the dungeon. By tradition, he'll be released in about 10 days. Hearing the time frame, Cian finally let out a breath of relief and thanked Hilda with a smile. The nurse quickly helped Cian settle into her new room and thoughtfully prepared a hot cup of tea. Cian thanked her politely and urged her to go rest early, but the nurse didn't leave. Worried, she lowered her voice and asked, "How does your highness feel the Barcelona family has been treating you?" The question made Cian pause instantly. Confused, she answered that they'd actually been treating her quite well. Not only had they moved her to a new room, they'd even added extra guards to protect her. Sensing the nurse had something else on her mind, Cian asked bluntly what she was really getting at. The nurse warned her sternly, "Don't let them fool you. Fine clothes and good food don't count as kindness. The hospitality here is ice cold, with no real warmth behind it at all. To them, you're nothing but a sacrifice that needs to be kept in good condition." Shin answered wearily that her life was already in their hands. Even if she tried to win them over, all she wanted was to live as peacefully as possible for however many days she had left. The nurse cut her off immediately. She warned Cian with utmost severity never to grow too close to anyone here. After all, she was only standing in for the real prince. The moment it was discovered that Xian was actually a girl, the entire royal family would fall into a disaster beyond saving. The nurse asked coldly, "If you're the one who breaks the agreement, what right do we have to demand the royal family keep its word?" Xian stayed silent for a moment, then laid the nurse's true thoughts bare. In truth, the nurse was afraid. She feared that even after all of this ended, they still wouldn't get the real prince back. And she feared even more that a mistake by Xian would drag her down along with it. Struck right where it hurt, the nurse had nothing left to say. Xin understood there was no way to change the current situation, short of the royal family wanting to reignite the war. She also knew the emperor didn't care about her in the slightest. After all, he had 6 sons. Losing one made no difference to him at all. Xian was nothing but a pawn that could be discarded at any moment. But she also knew the nurse wasn't entirely cold-blooded either. Everyone had a line inside them that couldn't be measured in mere self-interest. Xian hoped she would stop doubting her resolve. From the day she'd arrived here, she'd already prepared herself to die at any moment. She would die in this place under the name of Prince Xian Hor Ta. That vow pulled Xian back into a memory of the last night at the theater troupe. In that memory, the great stage lights blazed to life. A play about a doomed love affair was just beginning. On stage, the male lead begged in anguish for his lover to stay one more night. The actress playing his lover remained utterly resolute. We both knew from the start how this would end. As the whole audience focused on the unfolding story, no one noticed Letitia hiding behind a gap in the backstage door, watching the scene in silence. The actor on stage kept crying out in anguish. Could it be that all those days we spent together were nothing but a beautiful dream? Backstage had suddenly descended into chaos, everyone scrambling to prepare for the next scene. But right at the critical moment, Letitia, who was due on stage any second, had vanished. The stage manager ran around frantically searching for her. It turned out the girl was still hiding behind the door, frozen in a daze. He grabbed Letitia at once and urged her to get out on stage immediately. Before she could even collect herself, Letitia was shoved straight onto the stage. This time, the trouble was serious. The spotlight fell directly on her. Facing the dense, dark sea of the audience, Letitia's mind went completely blank. She didn't just forget her opening line, she couldn't even remember what she was supposed to do. The audience below began to murmur. The actor on stage grew anxious as well, whispering urgently for her to move. Sensing the performance was about to fall apart, he loudly recited his own line to remind Letitia that she was playing the role of the arsonist. Staring at the burning torch in her hand, Letitia was utterly stunned. Before she could even react, the flame on the torch suddenly went out of control. Fire surged and spread in the blink of an eye, swallowing the entire theater whole. Amid the sea of flames, a strange voice rang out beside Letitia's ear. "Why aren't you burning? Why is it only you who's unharmed?" Letitia collapsed to the ground in terror. All around her rang out countless screams for help and cries of agony. The sudden onslaught plunged her completely into panic. The fire in the dream coldly devoured everything in its path, and the cries around her grew louder and clearer. The ceiling above began to collapse, chunks of rubble raining down. At that critical instant, Shin's eyes flew open, jolting her out of the nightmare. Had that terrifying scene really just been a dream? She gasped for breath, unable to steady her racing heart. Even awake, Xian still felt a crushing weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Only when she looked down did she realize the cause had nothing to do with the nightmare at all. The white wolf named Tan was lying flat on top of her, heavy as a boulder, nearly enough to knock the air out of her lungs. She had to use every ounce of strength just to shove the massive wolf off to one side. Still catching her breath, Xian couldn't make sense of it. She was certain she'd shut the door the night before. So how in the world had this thing gotten in? From tomorrow on, she decided, she would absolutely lock her door tight before going to sleep. Shin had assumed this was just a one-time fluke. But she never expected that the next morning, the moment she opened her eyes, Tan would be lying on top of her again. Not just the second day, every single day after that went the same way. No matter how tightly Xian locked her door, the wolf slipped in right on schedule every night. She simply couldn't understand it. She'd never fed it, never encouraged it to bother her. So why did it keep coming back to her? And every morning, Tan vanished without leaving a single trace. If it weren't for the white fur left behind on her blanket, Xian might have believed the entire past few days had all just been an illusion. Right as she was lost in thought, The nurse came in and respectfully announced that breakfast was ready. Today's menu was bacon and cheese soup with lamb chops. Sian set her thoughts aside and sat down at the table. Looking at the generous breakfast before her, she said politely to the nurse, "You've gone to so much trouble." Then she scooped up a spoonful of hot soup and took a taste. The nurse stood quietly to the side watching Sian eat. Feeling watched so intently, Sian grew uncomfortable and asked the nurse to step out so she could eat in peace. The nurse hesitated slightly but ultimately answered respectfully before turning to leave. Alone in the room, Sian let out a quiet breath. Even though the two of them had once spoken frankly with each other, being alone with the nurse still always felt awkward. For now, though, she could only bear with it. Sian scooped up another spoonful of soup and was about to bring it to her mouth. At that exact moment, a scream suddenly rang out from outside the door. Aina burst in, panicked. "Your Highness, stop! You mustn't eat what's on the table." The sudden outburst left Sian frozen in place. Watching Aina appear out of nowhere, Sian asked, confused, "Where did you just come from?" Flustered at first, Aina explained she'd been hiding outside. Then, anxiously, she said there was something extremely important she had to tell Sian right away. Before Sian could even respond, Aina dropped a shocking bombshell. "The nurse has poisoned this bowl of soup." Sian was left utterly stunned. She could hardly believe the woman who had always been so deferential to her actually wanted her dead. Aina explained, lowering her voice, that she'd actually suspected the nurse for quite some time. Previously, everything about Sian's meals and daily care had been handled by Aina. But a few days ago, the nurse had suddenly forced her way into taking over. Though it had struck her as strange, Aina had had no choice but to hand the duties over given the nurse's rank. Tense, she added that she'd seen with her own eyes the nurse sprinkling a powder into Sian's food. Hearing this, Sian slowly closed her eyes. It seemed she'd still been far too naive. That secret agreement had never once stated she was required to die specifically in the underwater ritual. As for the nurse, all she ever truly wanted was to return to the real prince's side. Eliminating early someone who was already destined to die was simply a way to get herself home sooner. In truth, when Aina had first warned her, Sian had actually considered just drinking the soup. Instead of living every day in constant fear, always one step from having her lie exposed, she might as well let the nurse get what she wanted. For everyone involved, that might actually be a kind of release. Looking back on the days since her arrival, Shin had always been treated as nothing more than a sacrifice meant to break a curse. She'd been humiliated, treated worse than an animal. In everyone's eyes, she was nothing but a tool. Not one person had ever truly cared whether she lived or died. In the quiet dead of night, Sian lay fast asleep in her bed. Tan lay obediently curled up beside her. Just then, the closed door was gently pushed open. A shadowy figure appeared in the gap. Sian shot upright at once. The one standing before her bed was, once again, Yamuka. Yamuka clicked his tongue in annoyance. Only then did Sian understand. So this was why the White Wolf Tan disappeared without a trace every morning. Yamuka had been coming to collect it himself every single time. Tensely, Sian asked, "Do you come into my room every single night?" Yamuka answered coldly, "What if I do? Go back to sleep." Then he shot back a question of his own. "Or did you think I was coming here in the middle of the night to deal with you?" Shin awkwardly explained that hadn't crossed her mind at all, but inwardly, she couldn't help but wonder. If Tan kept wandering off like this, why didn't Yamuka just leash it instead of coming to fetch it himself every single time? Watching Yamuka prepare to leave, Sian hesitated, then spoke up on her own. "Next time Tan comes over, just let me know where I need to bring it. I can take it back myself. You don't need to make the trip in the middle of the night every time." Hearing the offer, Yamuka asked back, "Aren't you curious why I don't just chain it up?" Sian shook her head. "I'm not curious." The answer caught Yamuka a little off guard. "Why not?" Sian sighed quietly to herself. It seemed playing dumb to dodge the question wasn't going to work anymore. She had no choice but to explain. "Because I trust you have your own reasons for doing it this way. It's not just an oversight." Yamuka studied her for a long moment, then praised her. "You really are perceptive." The words instantly reminded Sian of Jenny. He'd once said the exact same thing to her. The overwhelming sense of déjà vu left her feeling strangely helpless. After that, Yamuka gave her an address. "If it wanders off again next time, bring it to the room in the middle of the 3rd floor." With that, he led Tan away, telling Sian to hurry back to bed. Watching Yamuka's retreating back, Shin politely told him to be careful. Once the door had closed, she couldn't help but sigh. Her life here seemed to grow more chaotic by the day. But before Sion could even lie back down, Yamuka, still standing outside the door, suddenly stopped and asked flatly, "I heard you went to see Jen today." The question caught Sion off guard, and she could only admit it honestly. Yamuka pressed further, "Did your nurse do something?" Sion was quietly alarmed. That had only happened this afternoon. How had word already reached him this fast? On the surface, she stayed calm and explained she simply wanted the nurse sent back to the Empire to reunite with her family. Hearing that, Yamuka seemed a little moved. I'll probably never set foot in the Empire in my lifetime, but at least she still has a chance to go home. Then he brought up something else. He mentioned he'd heard Sion would now be dining with the family and casually asked if that made her uncomfortable. Shin shook her head. "It's for my own safety. I'm sure your father agrees with it too." Yamuka teased her a little more, then said he'd see her at breakfast tomorrow before leading Tan away. The door closed, leaving Sion sitting alone on her bed. Time slipped quickly toward the next morning. In the lavish dining room, Sion, Yamuka, and Felix sat together at the table. Sion spoke up politely. "Thank you, Duke Barcelona, for taking the time to dine with me." Felix remained somewhat cool. "It's only for your safety. That's my responsibility." Hearing this, Sion kept a proper smile on her face, while silently steeling herself. What happened last time had genuinely terrified her, but today she was determined that whatever happened, she could stay calm. As far as she was concerned, nothing could possibly be more shocking than being kidnapped in the middle of a meal. But would reality actually play out the way she hoped? Felix suddenly asked. "I hear you wanted to send your nurse home. Why is that?" Xian sighed inwardly. Why did everyone keep asking the same question? She could only fall back on her usual excuse, explaining that the nurse simply couldn't adjust to life in a foreign land. Afterward, Xian asked in return whether that was a problem. Felix shook his head. "I just wanted to confirm it, since no one in this household could care for you quite like she did." Xian politely said she was fine. Felix added at once. "The carriage to send her back to the Empire is already prepared." The decisive speed of it all left Xian startled. The other side's capacity for action went far beyond anything she'd imagined. In a rare moment of warmth, Felix reassured her. "You don't need to worry about anything else from now on." Then he suggested everyone focus on the meal first. Shin nodded obediently, but couldn't help muttering to herself inwardly. What exactly had Felix meant by telling her not to worry? Before she could figure it out, the closed door was suddenly slammed hard. An angry roar erupted from outside. At that very moment, outside the ducal residence, the nurse was being roughly shoved into a carriage. Furious, she demanded to know where they were taking her. The attendant, his expression unchanged, announced flatly, "From today, she was officially being sent back to the Empire." The nurse still tried to argue that she couldn't possibly leave His Highness here all alone. The attendant smiled coldly and tore away the pretense. Poison had been found in His Highness's food. The investigation results were quickly reported to Felix. Upon learning the truth, he remained strangely calm, asking only flatly, "Are you certain?" The retainer lowered his voice to report. The food really was poisoned. The toxin was so mild, even a silver testing tool would barely detect it. But for a young child, that amount was more than enough to cause serious harm. That wasn't all. After hesitating a moment, the retainer voiced his gravest suspicion. He believed Xian had been mistreated by the nurse over a long period. Her body was simply far too thin. When she'd first arrived at House Barcelona, Xian had been skin and bones. Her skin and lips unusually dry and cracked. This discovery made the whole matter far more serious than it first appeared. The nurse hadn't just poisoned her. She may have been quietly abusing His Highness all along. The retainer continued gravely. Given the awkward position of someone suspected to be an illegitimate child, Shin had never once been properly cared for back in the Empire. Given how weak her body was now, even a tiny amount of poison could have unpredictable consequences. Felix cut in coldly. This cannot be overlooked. He stressed that Xian had been sent here under the terms of the treaty. From the moment she'd set foot in the territory, she had fallen entirely under House Barcelona's protection. He'd allowed the Empire's watchful eyes to stay near Xian purely for her own convenience, and that was never meant to give them free rein to act however they pleased. Felix's grip tightened. The quill in his hand snapped clean in two. This time, the Empire had truly crossed the line with him. The retainer asked quietly how they should deal with the nurse. Without lifting his head, Felix answered coldly, "Handle it the Barcelona way." Before long, a carriage departed from the ducal residence. But this particular carriage looked deeply unusual. The imperial crest was prominently mounted on its side, yet not a single guard rode with it. The red-haired man standing nearby couldn't resist a jab. "This is basically handing her straight over to bandits. She probably won't last 5 days." Watching the carriage disappear into the distance, the attendant smiled coldly. 5 days, huh? First, she'll need to survive those 5 days. He said coldly that he'd bet she wouldn't even make it 3. The others around him burst out laughing at that, teasing him for how ruthless the scheme really was. The attendant, however, paid it no mind at all. If the Empire insists on treating us as savages, then naturally, we should live up to their expectations. Meanwhile, Cian was drinking tea alone, her mind still turning over Yamuka's words, worried that her behavior might have given something away. Right as her thoughts spiraled, Aina came in carrying a tray, stepping in tensely and greeting her softly. Aina solemnly promised she'd take even better care of Cian from now on, making sure she never faced any inconvenience again. Hearing this, Cian answered coldly, "There's actually something I wanted to ask you." Before Aina could react, Cian said flatly, "I don't need you anymore." Then she delivered one final warning. Cian would ask Aina a few extremely important questions. The maid's answers would decide her fate going forward, whether she'd be sent back to the Empire like the nurse or meet an even worse end. Those words left Aina so frightened she sank straight to the floor, with no idea where she'd let something slip. Looking down at her from above, Cian said flatly, "Drop the act. Stop pretending to be clueless." She'd already known for a while that Aina was an Imperial spy, and that Aina understood Cian's true identity perfectly well. Aina completely fell apart, insisting over and over that she knew nothing, swearing she hadn't lied about the nurse poisoning the food. Shin couldn't help but laugh coldly. That very declaration of innocence was exactly what made things so suspicious. How could Aina have known at a single glance that the powder the nurse sprinkled into the food was poison? Aina scrambled to explain that she hadn't actually suspected poison at first. She'd just felt something was off and had gone to investigate. Shin's gaze turned ice cold. If she'd merely happened to see it and rushed straight to report it, where had she found the time to investigate? She pressed her step by step. Why had she always been watching the nurse? Out of suspicion or because it was her actual job? Aina immediately denied it loudly, insisting none of that was true at all. She'd only been in charge of His Highness's meals, which was exactly why she paid extra close attention to the nurse's every move. But before she could finish, Cian cut her off coldly. "Spare me the excuses." She slowly rose to her feet. "Even if what you're saying is true, since when did you start watching the nurse? What made you so certain she would poison the food?" Cian walked step by step toward Aina, staring coldly down at the woman crumpled on the floor. Whatever excuse Aina came up with, Cian could choose to believe it if she wanted, but that wasn't the only reason for her suspicion. She reached out and gripped Aina's chin, forcing her to look up and meet her eyes directly. The cold gaze made Aina tremble. She understood there was no way out left. Shin stared straight at the woman before her. "You're lying, aren't you?" Then she let go, asking coldly, "Do you really think you can keep playing dumb after all this?" Watching Aina's reaction, Cian only grew more certain of her suspicions. She pointed straight at the flaw on the other woman's face. Those freckles were painted on too, weren't they? The question struck right at Aina's weak spot. Unexpectedly, all traces of panic vanished from her, replaced by a curling smile at the corner of her mouth. "Fooling the eyes of a professional actress is never easy," Aina asked, a little astonished. "Did the Emperor really tell you even this?" Then she asked if Cian remembered her at all. Aina used to bring baskets of flowers to the theater all the time. It turned out her former mistress had once been a devoted fan of Letitia's. In the capital, Letitia's famous face had never really been something she could hide. But Cian had no patience left for reminiscing with her. Cian cut her off coldly and pressed the question. "So are you actually a spy sent here? Were you sent to watch me?" This time, Aina admitted it without hesitation. She really was the Emperor's eyes and ears sent here, but her real target wasn't Cian. It was the nurse who'd been secretly poisoning her. Shin asked, suspicious. "Are you her superior?" Aina denied it quickly. She was just a low-level operative assigned to keep watch over the nurse. If that fool hadn't dug her own grave, Aina could have kept working peacefully until it was time to go home. Watching her calm demeanor, Sian's suspicion only deepened. Aina's answers came far too smoothly for anyone to trust easily. Without warning, she suddenly grabbed hold of Sian's hand. That's exactly why we should be working together now. Aina did everything she could to prove her innocence. She only wanted to earn her keep and had absolutely no intention of harming Xian. What's more, without Aina's help, the days ahead wouldn't be easy for the girl. Confused, Xian asked, "What kind of trouble could I possibly run into?" Aina immediately laid out the stakes. If she and the nurse both vanished at the same time, the Empire would definitely grow suspicious. Whoever they sent next wouldn't be some amateur spy easy to handle like Aina. It could be a professional agent, cold and dangerous. If someone else took over the surveillance, Your Highness wouldn't even know who they were, and that's when things would get truly troublesome. Please spare me this once, and just treat today as if it never happened. Xian wasn't so easily convinced. What guarantee do I have that you won't betray me later just like the nurse did? Aina waved her hands quickly. There's no need to worry about that at all. Her former mistress had been a frail young lady from a minor branch of the royal family. After the young lady passed away, Aina had had nowhere else to go, which was why she'd been assigned to this mission. Now she had no way back, and nowhere to run to even if she wanted. What's more, Aina had only been a spy for 3 months, and had long since lost contact with her superiors. If she weren't so inexperienced, she wouldn't have been seen through by Xian this quickly. Looking at Aina's pitiful expression, Xian finally relented, agreeing to let the matter go for now. She released her grip, allowing Aina to stay on as her personal maid. Aina finally let out a breath of relief, but Xian immediately doused her with a bucket of cold water. I won't be alive much longer anyway, so there's no need for special treatment. Aina thought she was being far too pessimistic. Duke Barcelona seemed to be treating Xian rather well. He'd even had the nurse thrown out the moment the poisoning came to light. But Xian felt this was nothing more than a brief calm before the storm. Sooner or later, they would come for her too. Xian sighed and sat down. Worried? Aina asked. What's wrong? Did you change your mind again? Xian shook her head. I'm just thinking about something else. What Felix had said at breakfast still left her uneasy. He'd said everything would go according to her wishes, and that she didn't need to worry anymore. But the more he said that, the more something felt off to Xian. She even found herself starting to worry about the nurse who had just been sent away. Could she really make it back to the Empire safely? Aina reassured her that at worst, the nurse would just get called back and scolded. That was, after all, the natural consequence of acting on her own and disobeying orders. Besides, the nurse was still a noblewoman. Surely the Empire wouldn't go so far as to take her life. Shin didn't need to worry so much. She only gave a vague reply and said nothing more. Even though her relationship with the nurse had never been warm, a vague unease still lingered in her heart. All she could do was hope the woman made it back safely. Shin had no idea that, at that very moment, on a desolate mountain road, that same carriage had already been smashed to pieces. Nothing remained on the ground but trails of blood chilling enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. Around the same time, an attendant received word that someone was asking after the nurse's whereabouts. He looked puzzled, saying the carriage sent to take her back to the Empire had clearly departed 2 days earlier. Noticing Xian's concern, the attendant volunteered a few words about her. Before she left, she'd still been deeply worried about Your Highness, but she hadn't objected at all to being sent back to the Empire. We made sure she had plenty of money for the road, so Your Highness needn't worry. With things stated so plainly, Xian felt she shouldn't keep pressing the matter. All she could do was hope the nurse's journey went smoothly. After all, the Duke always handled things properly. Still lost in thought, Xian kept walking. But she hadn't gone far before the sound of footsteps ahead made her stop instinctively. The one approaching was none other than Yamuka. He greeted her first, then immediately asked, "Why haven't you come to my room?" Xian was momentarily confused and asked him to clarify, but she quickly caught the key detail. Earlier, out of caution, Xian had locked her door tightly, assuming that would keep him from coming to find her anymore. She answered coolly that at night she had no reason to bring Tan to his room. Yamuka said nothing more after hearing this, simply replying calmly, "I see." The two of them just stood there in the corridor, neither one speaking further. Unsure what he was actually getting at, Shion probed carefully. Were you waiting for me to show up? Yamuka said coldly that Tan kept watch outside Sion's door every single night, and that he had to come collect it every single time. Which meant he understood perfectly well that Shion had no reason to bring Tan to his room on her own initiative. Yamuka stated flatly, I was never waiting for you. Sion was even more confused. If he wasn't waiting, then why had he asked, the moment they crossed paths, why she hadn't come? Faced with that pointed question, Yamuka couldn't say a word, simply standing there in silence. After a long moment, he admitted, almost helplessly, I don't know either. With that, Yamuka turned and walked away, leaving Sion standing there completely bewildered. Night fell, and the ducal residence grew quiet. Even Tan, lying guard outside her door, had already fallen fast asleep. But Sion tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep no matter what. Her mind kept circling back to everything Yamuka had said that afternoon. The more she thought about it, the stranger his attitude seemed. When she suggested he'd been waiting for her, Yamuka had denied it flatly. When she suggested he hadn't been, his tone had sounded strangely unnatural. Turning it over again and again, a thought suddenly surfaced in Sion's mind. Could this guy actually be trying, in his own roundabout way, to invite her over? After a few days living here, Sion felt utterly exhausted. It seemed like no one in this family knew how to have a normal conversation, especially that stern old Jen. Whenever mealtime came around, no matter where he was, all he'd bark out was one single blunt word: eat. The atmosphere grew so awkward no one could bear to linger. Late that night, Yamuka sat alone in his room holding a small object in his hand, lost in thought. Right at that moment, a knock sounded from outside. After he gave permission, the one who walked in was Sion, still in her nightclothes. She looked a little awkward, and greeted Yamuka softly. Sion led Tan into the room and let it settle onto the long couch. Yamuka said flatly, I was actually planning to come get it myself. Sion explained, a bit tense, that she'd simply been passing by and decided to bring it back herself. Sion ventured a question. Can I still come here after this? Yamuka stayed silent for a moment, then simply answered, Suit yourself. Sion quietly let out a breath of relief, lucky that her guess today had been right. Mission accomplished. The awkward atmosphere made her want to leave as quickly as possible. But just as Sion was about to say her goodbyes, Yamuka suddenly called her back, ordering her to wait until Tan had fallen properly asleep. Seeing Tan's eyes already closed, Sion asked quietly, Isn't it already asleep? Yamuka's expression didn't change at all. He signaled for Tan to get up. This isn't where it sleeps. He gestured for Sion to follow, then walked straight toward the deepest part of the room. A hidden door swung open. Blinding light poured out at once. Sion followed him inside and froze completely at the sight before her. The room was packed with lavish clothing and accessories. She asked, hardly believing it, Is this just a dressing room? Yamuka calmly confirmed it. He slowly opened a large wardrobe. Tan obediently climbed inside. Then Yamuka turned back, giving Sion a moment to say goodnight. Sion hesitated, then stepped forward and murmured softly to the wolf inside the wardrobe. Sleep well, but the bizarre scene left her completely unable to make sense of it. He'd said he was taking Tan to sleep, so why put it inside a wardrobe? A ducal residence this vast surely wasn't short on spare rooms. Yamuka clearly cared about it this much. Why would he do something so nonsensical? Right as Sion's confusion peaked, a very faint sound suddenly rang out from beyond the door. Who else would be walking around the corridor this late at night? Before she could react, Yamuka had already emerged from the shadows, his expression completely changed. He grabbed Sion and pulled her deep into the wardrobe. Yamuka gestured for her to stay silent, then quickly shut the wardrobe door. The sudden turn of events left Sion's mind completely blank. All she could do was clamp a hand over her mouth, holding her breath in the darkness, not daring to move. Through the narrow crack in the door, Sion tensely watched what was happening outside. Who in the world was approaching this place in the middle of the night? Felix's voice rang out beyond the door. He issued a warning. Tan needs to stay obediently in the tower. Yamuka stood grim-faced, blocking the doorway, coldly facing down Felix as he approached. The air froze instantly. Sion held her breath inside the wardrobe. The terrifying pressure outside left her entire body rigid. Yamuka refused to yield an inch, demanding loudly, Why can't Tan even get some fresh air outside? You've taken it out yourself before. The two of them clashed fiercely the moment they met. What kind of terrifying secret was really hidden inside Tan? Felix's expression didn't change as he explained. What I brought out before was only a clone. Tan's true body is inside there. Hearing the words true body, Yamuka froze as if struck by lightning. Felix had no patience left to waste more words. I'm taking Tan away right now. Yamuka completely lost control, shouting furiously that he wouldn't allow him to take his brother away. But Felix didn't flinch at all. He walked straight forward and opened the closed wardrobe. Then, Felix began pushing with his foot. The heavy wardrobe tilted to one side. Hiding in the corner, confused, Cian thought. Wasn't he just going to take Tan away? Why go through the trouble of moving the whole wardrobe? Amid a grating, screeching sound, the massive wardrobe was shoved completely out of place. No one had expected a pitch-black coffin to be hidden beneath the wardrobe's floor. Felix's expression stayed unchanged, and he lifted the coffin up, then coldly signaled for his retainers to leave. He held the black coffin tightly in his arms and walked out without ever looking back. Yamuka screamed in despair at his retreating figure. It's just a cold, lifeless body, someone who died long ago. What difference does it make where you put the coffin? Felix didn't hesitate for even a moment. He carried the coffin away and vanished into the night. Only Yamuka was left standing there, utterly stunned, alone. Watching the direction Felix had gone, Cian finally couldn't hold back and asked quietly, "What exactly was that thing the Duke just took away?" Yamuka answered, dazed but calm. That was Tan. Cian was completely lost. Tan was clearly still asleep in the wardrobe, so why was it also inside the coffin that had just been carried off? That was when Yamuka finally revealed the cruel truth. The wolf still in the wardrobe was only a clone. Tan was, in fact, Yamuka's biological younger brother, and he had died many years ago. Hearing such a shattering secret, Cian couldn't find any words at all. Worried, she asked if they should go after Felix. Yamuka only laughed coldly. What reason would I have to follow him? What tragedy had truly unfolded between this father and son, locked in so much resentment toward each other? Cian sighed helplessly and said it plainly. The Duke just took away the truest, most real part of who you are. Yamuka lowered his eyes and echoed the words back, dazed. His voice was heavy with a helpless, aching sorrow. Late that night, Cian tossed and turned in bed, her mind in complete chaos. She had only meant to bring Tan back. She never expected to accidentally uncover the deepest secret buried in this household. Countless questions swirled endlessly through her head, leaving her utterly unable to sleep. The image of Yamuka turning away so achingly alone kept surfacing again and again. The sorrow and pain in his eyes were enough to make anyone's heart ache just from witnessing it. Before leaving, Yamuka had slowly turned back and looked at Cian coldly. Everything in this castle belongs to my father, and that includes you two, with no exceptions. He warned her that she'd be wise to stay in her place, and never attempt to cross the line. Those icy words dropped Cian straight into an emotional abyss, leaving her unable to respond. Back in her room, she lay awake the entire night. The phrase, "don't cross the line," kept echoing relentlessly in her mind. What dangerous abyss was Yamuka's threatening tone actually pointing toward? How could a creature raised in this household suddenly turn out, in the blink of an eye, to be a young master who had died long ago? If Yamuka himself hadn't spoken the truth aloud, Cian would surely have dismissed it as nothing but an absurd tale. But if all of it was real, then why did they have to hide the coffin beneath the floor of a dressing room? Whatever secret lay behind it was probably more terrifying than she could imagine. What could have possibly happened to a person that they now had to live on in the form of a white wolf beast? If he had truly died, why not hold a proper funeral and let him rest in peace, instead of hiding him away as something that could never be brought into the light? Cian vaguely sensed that beneath the seemingly peaceful surface of the ducal household, some enormous conspiracy was quietly taking shape. In the bath, still turning over last night's secret in her mind, Cian was startled when Aina suddenly appeared beside her. She said wearily that she'd already made it clear she didn't need any help. Aina replied firmly that looking after her daily needs was simply the duty of a personal maid. Watching the maid's overly enthusiastic attentiveness, Cian could only give in helplessly. As she washed Cian's hair, Aina muttered to herself, "I remember your Highness's hair used to be so curly as a child. How did it turn out so smooth and straight once it got wet? The comment left Xian momentarily lost. Aina leaned in close, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret, recalling how Xian had looked as a child, and kept praising how much she'd resembled a curly-haired little angel. Hearing this, Xian could only sigh. That hairstyle had obviously been styled that way on purpose by the people in the troupe. Aina didn't try to dodge the point at all, laughing as she admitted she already knew. But more than the hairstyle, what she cared about was Xian's face. Watching the girl's helpless expression, Aina declared seriously that a striking appearance was, after all, the most important qualification for a personal maid like herself. Aina sighed with genuine feeling. No wonder both the Duke and the young master think so highly of your highness. At the words young master, Xian's hand froze mid-motion. She warned coldly, "Don't ever call Yamuka that again." Aina looked confused. Xian offered no further explanation. She understood exactly why Yamuka resisted that title. The term young master always reminded him of Tan. His younger brother, who had also once been a child of House Barcelona, was now treated as though he no longer existed at all. Aina remarked casually that Xian would probably be staying here for good from now on anyway. She might as well make herself more comfortable. At the phrase, staying here for good, Xian's heart suddenly clenched. To hide her sudden panic, she instinctively plunged her head under the hot water. Startled, Aina fumbled to pull her back out. Watching Xian struggle, Aina couldn't help but scold her for being so careless with herself. Xian sat in her room, lost in thought for a long time. If she'd already decided to stay, there was no reason to keep cowering in fear. She made up her mind and walked straight to Yamuka's door. Standing before the closed door, Xian stated plainly why she'd come. She wanted to talk about what had happened the night before. But from inside, Yamuka coldly turned her away. This time, Xian refused to back down. "I absolutely need to talk to you." Through the door, she said plainly, "You should take back that coffin." The door was suddenly yanked wide open. Yamuka's face turned cold as he warned her not to meddle in other people's business. "You're just a prisoner here. You have no right to interfere in this family's affairs." Xian refused to back off at all. "If that's true, then why could you only stand there and watch yesterday, while your father carried that coffin away?" Stung by the accusation, Yamuka snapped angrily that the man was his father. Xian immediately tore away that flimsy excuse. "Back then, you actually wanted to chase after him. Didn't you?" Yamuka froze. To say goodbye to Tan, to see him just one more time. Weren't those reasons enough on their own? Yamuka wavered slightly, but still stubbornly warned Xian not to act on pure emotion. She didn't believe a word of it. What exactly was that coffin? You knew perfectly well it could never leave that tower, and yet you still hid it under the wardrobe. Wasn't that because at the time you simply had no other choice? Xian said honestly that she hadn't meant to meddle in someone else's business, but she'd seen how genuinely tormented Yamuka had been in that moment. If his position in this family kept him from acting, Xian was willing to give him a push from behind. She stepped forward, grabbed the hem of Yamuka's shirt, and made a solemn promise. "I'll be the reason you need to act." The words left Yamuka completely stunned. Finally, he gave in and revealed the forbidden secret his family had kept hidden all along. Felix had never once acknowledged Tan's death. From the moment he was born, Tan had faced a threat to his very survival. Before she succumbed, Astrid had had no choice but to transfer the child's soul into the body of a beast shaped like a white wolf. That was the only reason Tan still existed in his current form at all. Yamuka asked painfully, "Can a body that's lost its soul really still be called alive?" Right now, Tan could only go on existing inside that white wolf's body, with almost no chance of ever becoming human again. To Yamuka, his brother was, in every way that mattered, already gone. But Felix couldn't accept that truth, and stubbornly kept holding on to the coffin inside the tower. After hearing all of this, Xian asked him directly, "You want Tan to finally rest in peace? Don't you?" Yamuka fell into silence. Xian immediately proposed, "Then let's go take back that coffin together." Yamuka felt the idea was far too reckless. Xian played her final card, smiling as she threatened him. "If you don't agree, I'll end everything right here, right now." The forced ultimatum left Yamuka speechless. Worried, he asked what would happen if his father found out. To his surprise, Xian answered calmly, "So what?" She smiled. "Whatever happens, my worst-case outcome is still just the one thing. Her attitude of having nothing left to lose left Yamuka utterly unable to argue back. To reclaim that vitally important coffin, the two of them cooked up an incredibly flimsy plan. Shin would drape white cloth over her head and pose as Tan to sneak into the heavily guarded tower, then secretly smuggle the coffin out. Looking at a plan riddled with holes, even Sion felt uneasy. Could this possibly work? Yamuka, on the other hand, was resolute. It has to work, whether it can or not. He'd already been blacklisted just yesterday. Short of storming in by force, they had no other option left. Looking at the heavily guarded gate ahead, the two of them could only grit their teeth and press forward. Yamuka explained quietly that the guards only knew Tan was being kept in the tower. They had no idea what was actually inside was a coffin. As long as Sion mimicked Tan's shape convincingly, they could fool the guards into letting her through. To make the disguise more believable, Yamuka draped a large white cloth over Sion and told her to keep both her hands and feet curled up. Sion's frame was too small, so she'd have to pass herself off as something bulkier to be convincing. Once everything was ready, Yamuka carried her toward the tower. The moment the guards spotted him, they bowed respectfully. "Young master." Yamuka's expression didn't change as he asked outright where the Duke was. Every step from here mattered. The guard answered that Felix was currently inside the tower. Just as Yamuka moved to step inside, a long spear blocked his path. The guard said awkwardly, "The Duke has given an absolute order. No one is permitted to enter today. Not even the young master himself." Yamuka took a step back. "I'm only bringing Tan in. I'll leave right after." But the guard's stance remained just as firm. Hidden beneath the white cloth, Sion was so tense she didn't dare breathe hard. Clearly, they couldn't force their way through. Yamuka instantly shifted tactics, staring coldly at the guard. "If I'm not allowed in, then you carry Tan, who's sleeping right now, in for me." Before the soldier could answer, Yamuka used Felix's own order to counter him. "Have you forgotten the rules? No matter what happens, no one is to enter the tower on their own, and Tan can never be left outside alone under any circumstances." Those words left the guards speechless. Yamuka's retreat as advanced tactic had struck exactly where it hurt. If something really happened to Tan, none of them could bear the responsibility. In the end, the guard had no choice but to yield and let Yamuka into the tower. He specifically warned him to be quick and absolutely not to let the Duke find out. The heavy door slowly creaked open. Yamuka carried Sion and slipped smoothly inside. Once the door had shut safely behind them, the first step was finally a success. The moment they reached a safe spot with no one around, Yamuka set Sion down at once and signaled that she could come out now. Having been wrapped up for so long, Shin quickly pulled the cloth off and gulped down deep breaths of air. That standoff at the gate had genuinely left her drenched in cold sweat. The two of them had finally made it inside. Sion patted her chest, saying, hardly believing it herself, that such a flimsy plan had actually worked. But before she could even catch her breath, the strangely familiar surroundings suddenly made something click in Sion's mind. This was the very same tower Felix had once brought her to before. Yamuka sighed helplessly. "I told you to keep your eyes shut, and yet you've somehow noticed more than anyone else would have." A little caught out, Sion explained that she'd simply felt the air here was very familiar. Yamuka didn't press the matter further. "Since you've already seen this much, there's honestly nothing left worth hiding. Stay close behind me." He took the lead, walking deeper inside. Watching his back, Xian felt a knot of unease settle in. What other secrets could the deepest reaches of this tower still be hiding? Yamuka led her up, floor by floor. Finally, he stopped before a closed door. He lowered his voice. "The coffin is in this room." Yamuka calmly laid out the plan. Felix was probably up on the very top floor with Astrid right now. As long as they moved quietly enough, the two of them wouldn't cross paths. But before they'd even started, Yamuka turned back to find Sion too exhausted to even stand up straight. He couldn't resist a jab. "Your stamina really is terrible." Xian was choked with frustration, but she truly was utterly worn out, and for once, couldn't come up with a comeback. She still muttered under her breath, unhappy. "We just climbed almost all the way to the top of the tower in one go. Of course it's exhausting, isn't it?" Yamuka didn't argue the point either, simply telling her to catch her breath while she could. Once they had the coffin, they'd need to retreat immediately. He pushed open the closed door. The moment Sion stepped inside, the sight before her left her stunned. Every corner was filled with strange instruments and vials of unknown liquid, making the whole place look like some kind of mysterious laboratory. Xian quietly wondered if this used to be Astrid's old workroom. But before she could take a closer look, Yamuka, walking ahead of her, suddenly stopped in his tracks. He stared at a bare patch of floor and said, low-voiced, "It's not here." Xian was confused. "What's not here?" Yamuka's expression turned grave. "The coffin should have been right here." He stared at the empty floor. "Tan is gone." Xian was left completely stunned. They'd fought their way here through so much trouble, only to find the one thing that actually mattered missing entirely. Yamuka couldn't make sense of it. If Felix had wanted to move the coffin somewhere else, why would he have gone through the trouble of taking it back from him in the first place? None of this added up. Xian was anxious too. If it's not here, where could it have been taken? Just as Yamuka reached down to inspect the magic circle etched into the floor, the room suddenly shook violently. The sudden jolt made both their hearts clench in their chests. Had they just triggered some mechanism they shouldn't have touched? In the deepest recesses of the castle, Felix walked alone, lantern in hand, toward a secret pool of water. No one would have guessed a sleeping woman lay beneath that very water. Felix looked down at her and softly called out her name. Astrid. She remained peacefully asleep, undisturbed. Felix didn't linger long, only murmuring a quiet promise. "I'll come again tomorrow." He turned to leave, but before he'd gone very far at all, the entire castle suddenly shook violently. The unexpected tremor threw everyone into chaos. Guards turned toward the tower, horrified to realize a massive explosion had just gone off. The tower began collapsing across a wide stretch. Whatever was happening this time had truly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Floodwaters surged in, and fierce flames roared to life all around. The sound of rushing water and raging fire instantly dragged Xian back into that horrifying memory from years ago. In Letitia's memory, a red-haired woman held her tightly. Letitia sobbed in fear, calling out, "Sister." Her sister gently comforted her. "You'll definitely make it out." But Letitia didn't want to leave. If she left everyone else behind, what was she supposed to do? Outside the door, complete chaos had already broken out. Some people were screaming for help with the fire. Others were desperately trying to force the door open. But the way out had already been sealed shut. Letitia cried that she didn't want to go, that she'd rather stay behind with everyone else. Before she'd even finished speaking, the raging current had already swept her away. Her sister screamed her name in panic, but it was already far too late. The fire grew fiercer by the second. A dark-haired young man urged Letitia to get away as fast as she could. They'd found a passage on the verge of collapse. He pointed to the narrow gap. "This place is about to give way, but you're small enough. You might just make it through." No one could guarantee her safety, but it was the only path to survival left. Watching Letitia hesitate, the people behind her all called out to reassure her that they'd follow right after. But could that hopeful promise actually come true? Everyone urged her with everything they had never to look back. As long as Letitia made it out and found help, they'd still have one flicker of hope. But she understood full well that it was nothing more than a lie meant to comfort her. With the fire raging that fiercely outside, there was truly no way anyone could get out. Letitia had no choice left. She gritted her teeth and crawled forward into the tunnel. The darkness around her was so thick she couldn't even see her own hand. She couldn't even tell anymore whether she was moving forward or just circling in place. Could this one path to survival really carry her out of the sea of flames? In that cramped, pitch-black passage, starved of air and utterly exhausted, Letitia's consciousness began to blur. Her eyelids grew too heavy to keep open. Just as she was about to black out completely, an urgent voice suddenly rang out beside her ear, calling her back again and again. The voice from the present slowly layered over the cries in her memory, pulling her back to reality. Xian's eyes opened. Yamuka was right beside her. Dazed, she asked, "Where are we?" Yamuka said, grim-faced. "The tower has completely collapsed. We're trapped under the rubble." He asked how she was feeling. Shen moved her body and found that, aside from a few scrapes on her arm, she wasn't badly hurt. Looking at the ruins around them, she couldn't help but marvel. "We really got lucky this time." Yamuka immediately doused her with cold water. "Did you hit your head or something?" Xian explained, a little embarrassed, that surviving a fall from that height at all was practically a miracle in itself. This time Yamuka didn't argue. He simply pointed to the pile of wood beside them and told Cian to start clearing the boards. Buried this deep underground, could clearing away debris like this really lead them to a way out? As they worked, Cian suddenly felt a draft coming from behind one of the boards. Yamuka warned her to be careful not to cause another collapse. Shin gently shifted the piece of wood aside. To her surprise, a passage had been hidden behind it. Delighted, she called for Yamuka to come with her, but he stayed leaning against the wall and said low-voiced, "I can't go." Cian turned back confused. Only then did she notice Yamuka's left leg was badly injured. Blood had pooled on the ground, so he'd been enduring it in silence the whole time. Shin panicked instantly. "When did you get hurt? Trapped in rubble, completely cut off from the outside world? With Yamuka injured like this, could the two of them possibly still escape together?" He explained helplessly that he'd already been like this when he came to, probably from the impact of the fall. Anxious, Cian offered to help support him as they walked. Yamuka shook his head. He'd lost too much blood and couldn't move at all. What's more, the rubble could collapse again at any moment. Forcing the two of them to go together would only get them both buried. "You go on ahead and find someone to help." Outside the collapsed tower, chaos had erupted like a boiling pot. Knights shouted anxiously that young Master Yamuka was still trapped underneath. Everyone was ordered to begin the search at once. Both inside and outside had descended into pure desperation. Could they hold on until help arrived? Noticing something off about the rubble pile, an attendant quickly shielded the maid standing behind him, shouting for her to step back. The two of them hadn't even steadied themselves before a deafening crack rang out ahead. Huge slabs of ice began spreading wildly. The entire scene spiraled completely out of control. Everyone screamed in terror, urging each other to fall back. The entire ruined tower kept collapsing across an even wider area. Amid the earth-shaking roar and billowing dust, everything was swallowed whole. Did anyone trapped inside still have any hope of surviving? Amid the rubble, Felix held the unconscious Astrid tightly in his arms. Ignoring the wounds covering his own body, he immediately ordered someone to fetch a healer. Seeing Felix's body covered in injuries, his retainer frowned and offered to take over caring for Astrid. Felix coldly refused. "These wounds are nothing." Just as the two of them were still at an impasse, an aide rushed over urgently, anxiously reporting the situation. The guards had just submitted an extremely strange report. The secret of Xian sneaking into the tower could no longer be concealed. In front of the ruins, Felix held the newly rescued Astrid, the air around them heavy with tension. A few guards scrambled over, dropping to their knees before the Duke, begging for mercy over and over. Desperate to dodge responsibility, they immediately blurted out that Yamuka had insisted on bringing Tan into the tower, and that there had been nothing they could do to stop him. Hearing the guards openly shift the blame, Felix's eyes turned to ice. A pained cry rang out. One of them collapsed instantly amid the chaos. Felix said coldly, "Repeat what you just said." The remaining guard trembled as he admitted they truly had broken orders and let Yamuka into the tower. But Felix immediately pointed out the flaw. Tan never left the tower yesterday, so who exactly had Yamuka carried in? Faced with that fatal question, the guard could only stammer out, in desperation, that the figure had been wrapped tightly in cloth, but it had genuinely been Yamuka carrying it in himself. The secret that someone had disguised themselves as Tan to sneak into the tower could no longer be hidden. Only then did the attendant realize the truth. What had been carried into the tower was never an animal or an object at all. It was Prince Cian. He tried to piece the clues together, assuming Yamuka couldn't possibly have pulled this off alone. But before he could finish, Felix cut him off coldly. Before the two of them could reach any conclusion, a thunderous explosion suddenly erupted in the distance. Flames shot up high, swallowing the tower whole. A second explosion tore through the ruins. The blast plunged the already chaotic scene entirely into a sea of fire. Staring at the raging flames before him, Yamuka shouted anxiously, "Cian, what are you doing?" Cian answered calmly, "I'm just starting a fire." Yamuka panicked instantly. "Why would you do that? Are you planning to burn us both alive before the flames even reach us?" Cian quickly protested loudly. "That's absolutely not what I meant." Yamuka couldn't process any of it, convinced she'd lost her mind, and urged her to call for help immediately. But before he could finish, Cian suddenly reached out from behind and placed a hand on his shoulder. She called softly, "Yamuka." He turned around startled. Cian asked quietly, "Do you resent me?" Yamuka, confused, asked why he would. Sion was full of guilt. She believed she'd dragged him into this, pulling Yamuka into this whole murky mess. Yamuka gave a self-mocking smile. This isn't about who dragged who. I'm the one who let my emotions take over. He even admitted plainly that he already regretted it. Sion was a little surprised. Looking at her badly wounded companion, her resolve hardened completely. I will not leave you behind to run off alone. I'm getting you out of here no matter what. Sion suddenly stood up. Yamuka seemed to realize what she was about to do and quickly tried to stop her. But his wound suddenly tore open, the pain so severe he couldn't move at all. Watching Sion walk step by step toward the flames, all Yamuka could do was shout, "Don't do something so reckless." Sion stopped, turned her back to him, and quietly apologized. If I fail in a moment, I might not look very pretty afterward, so I'm sorry in advance. Yamuka shouted anxiously for her to turn back. But Shin never looked back, walking straight toward the flames. For her, only in the instant of truly facing death could certain things finally become clear. Staring at the wall of fire before her, Sion's heart grew strangely still. In that moment, she finally felt the emotions everyone here had kept buried so deep inside. Sorrow, fear, and a love so profound it had been buried at the very bottom of their hearts. Standing before the fire, Sion silently prayed. If there truly was a God in this world, she hoped this time she would be granted help. Just like her family all those years ago, who had chosen to stay behind in that sea of flames so that she alone could live. Sion asked only for a little courage, enough to step forward without hesitating. Deep inside her body, something like a mysterious stone had always lain dormant. Normally silent, it still always felt like a weight pressing down on her. Every so often that stone would stir, and the pain would become unbearable. Whether she was walking, eating, or sleeping, it could act up without warning. Each time, all she could do is quietly wait for it to settle back down. That was until she met Astrid. With just one glance, Astrid had recognized that Sion too was a mage. She'd said the power inside Sion would ordinarily awaken on its own, but if it encountered a source of power with an opposing attribute, it could be forced awake instead. Since Sion carried the water attribute, the most direct method was simply to jump into fire. Astrid had also promised that an opposing source of power wouldn't easily take her life. Now Sion finally understood what she had to do. Honestly, she was so terrified she could barely breathe. Fire was both scorching and agonizing, capable of reducing anything to ash. Her own family had vanished into flames just like this, all those years ago. But there was one thing in this world that Letitia feared even more than death itself. That was having to keep living. If she alone survived, carrying a scent of ash she could never wash away, existing like a walking corpse, that fate would be even more terrifying than being devoured by the flames. If the miracle really happened, if she truly was, as Astrid had said, a powerful mage capable of surviving this fire, then just how much would she come to hate herself afterward? Right as the flames were about to spiral completely out of control, raindrops suddenly began falling from the sky. Moments later, a torrential downpour crashed down like a waterfall. Yamuka looked up, unable to believe it. At the most critical moment, the sky had truly opened up with rain. Everyone around cried out in astonishment that this had to be a miracle, but amid the sudden downpour, Hilda only watched quietly. Could this rain really solve every danger they faced? Hilda suddenly pointed ahead and shouted, "Over there!" Felix reacted instantly, ordering everyone to follow the headmaid at once, while he himself stayed behind with Astrid. Through the pouring rain, Hilda ran like the wind. She could feel it clearly. Someone up ahead was waiting for them. At the same moment, Felix too sensed something was wrong. A terrifyingly powerful surge of magic filled the air. The power was so overwhelming it felt almost unbearable, as if whoever wielded it were deliberately provoking them, loudly announcing their own existence. A true duel of magic had begun. Who could possibly be standing ahead of them? That power was violent to an absurd degree, nothing like anything a human being should ever be able to possess. Hilda strained against the crushing pressure. Above the collapsed tower, a terrifying pillar of light was surging straight up into the sky. That surge of power wasn't just overwhelming, it carried with it an unbearable wave of pain. Sion was, at that very moment, suffering agony beyond imagination, as if her entire body were about to be torn apart. So this was what it felt like to be consumed by fire. In her daze, Shin couldn't feel her right hand at all anymore. She even suspected it had already turned to ash. All she felt inside was guilt. Yamuka had risked everything to stop her, and yet she'd started that fire anyway. She'd believed it was the only way to save someone, and instead had thrown everything into chaos. In reality, Yamuka had been keeping watch alone at her bedside, growing more anxious by the minute as Sian showed no sign of waking. Unable to hold back any longer, he leaned in, touched her, and asked, "How long do you plan on sleeping?" Perhaps hearing that voice, deep within the darkest layer of her consciousness, Sian finally responded. She jolted awake from the nightmare, her mind still completely scrambled. As her surroundings came into focus, Sian realized she was lying on a soft, comfortable bed. Beside her was Yamuka, also covered in injuries. She lay there utterly dazed, unable to remember anything that had happened afterward. Shin coughed violently and asked weakly, "What exactly happened?" Hearing the sound, Hilda hurried over carrying water. "Your Highness, drink some water first." Shin took the cup, but the doubt inside her only grew. Weren't they trapped under the rubble? Why were they suddenly back here? She sipped the water and murmured a quiet thank you. Hilda smiled and bowed. "Congratulations, Your Highness, on awakening your magical power." Hearing the news, Sian froze completely. No wonder her body had ached so terribly before. So it hadn't been an accident at all. It had been the sign of her power awakening. Looking at the familiar surroundings, Sian murmured in a daze, "Am I still alive?" Hilda answered gently. "Fortunately, yes, Your Highness truly is still alive. Since your power just awakened, some discomfort in the body is unavoidable. It's simply the process of the magic adjusting to you." But before she could finish, Shin had already lowered her head in guilt. "I'm sorry." The sudden apology caught Hilda completely off guard. Shin gripped the edge of her blanket tightly, blaming herself for having insisted on storming into the tower, saying that if she hadn't, no one would have been put in such danger. Hilda listened quietly. Sian continued, saying that after learning the truth about Tan, she simply couldn't look away, which was why she'd stubbornly insisted on bringing the coffin back. At first, Yamuka had fiercely objected, only to end up dragged into danger because of her. Sian looked down at her own hands in anguish. If I'm able to awaken now, why couldn't I do it back then? Was it because everyone protected me too carefully back then? Because I'd never actually stood face to face with death, so I simply had no will to awaken? If I had managed to do this back then, wouldn't everyone still be alive today? Shin's voice began to tremble uncontrollably. She said she was ready to accept any punishment at all. Watching Sian drown in self-blame, Hilda sighed helplessly. "It was precisely because Your Highness called down that rain that we were able to rescue Yamuka in time. His injuries aren't too severe either. There won't be any lasting damage." Xian still couldn't let it go, convinced she was the reason Yamuka had suffered so much pain. Seeing this, Hilda felt she had no choice but to tell her the truth. "Yamuka wasn't the one who carried you back here." The healer had told him again and again that he needed to stay in bed and rest, but he'd still leaned on a crutch, dragging his injured leg down from the floor above, one painful step at a time, just to confirm with his own eyes that Your Highness was safe. Xian found it hard to believe. Why would he do something like that? Only he knows the exact reason, but Yamuka has come here to watch over you every single day since. Hilda continued, "Your Highness still believes all of this is your fault, but someone has already taken on all the blame himself." In a separate room, Yamuka stood rigidly before Felix, openly admitting to every wrongdoing. Felix's face darkened as he asked coldly, "Was it your own idea to go to the Western Tower and steal Tian's coffin?" Yamuka didn't hesitate for even a moment. "It was entirely my idea. To protect Xian, he chose to shoulder every consequence alone." Felix's voice turned even colder as he pressed further. "Did you know beforehand that Xian was a mage?" Yamuka shook his head. "I didn't know. I was badly injured at the time. Her Highness threw herself into the fire alone just to save me." Hearing this, both the retainer and Hilda standing nearby were stunned. Felix turned to Hilda for confirmation. She explained that using an opposing element to force an awakening truly was an extreme method. The process was practically no different from throwing oneself straight into a fire capable of consuming everything. Felix fell silent after hearing this. He simply told Yamuka to focus on recovering, then turned and left. Hilda pulled herself back from the memory and continued speaking to Cian. Yamuka took on all the blame just to protect you. She looked at Cian in bed. The Duke still hasn't heard your side of the story. Even if the two accounts don't match, I'll pretend I never heard any of this. Hilda gently comforted the self-blaming girl. Yamuka has never once resented you. On the contrary, if you hadn't risked your life back then, he might never have made it out of that rubble at all. So really, you're the one who saved him. Cian looked over at Yamuka lying beside her. Her hand was gripped so tightly in his it had gone slightly numb. She couldn't understand how someone so badly wounded could still hold on with such force. In that terrifying dream, Shin had felt as though she were nothing but a handful of ash, with no arms or legs, drifting helplessly on the wind. Having lost everything, she'd felt she could drift anywhere at all. But right as she was about to dissolve completely, a hand had gripped her tight. That hand had held on with a force that felt almost desperate, as if saying, "You are not ash." Even as she and herself was ready to give up, that person had refused to let go, pulling her back from the cold, bottomless abyss into reality. Confused, Cian looked up and asked Hilda, "How were we rescued that day?" Hilda sighed. "It's only natural you don't remember. You used your own magic to open up a path." Through the pouring rain, Hilda had watched from a distance as Cian struggled to support Yamuka, step by step out through a gap in the rubble. But before she could even reach them, the moment she saw help arriving, Cian had let out a breath of relief and collapsed from exhaustion. "It scared me so badly I rushed straight over." Hilda said Cian had passed out right there on the spot. Hearing this, she vaguely recalled a few fragments. But at the time, she clearly hadn't even had a chance to call for help. Hilda explained that anyone with weaker power tends to be drawn toward a stronger source of it. That strange sense of resonance existed even among mages. Years ago, that very phenomenon had once led Felix to mistakenly believe Hilda had feelings for Astrid. He'd even had her buried in a potato field over it. Shin listened, bewildered. Hilda laughed and explained that it was precisely that pull that had let her pinpoint Cian's exact location beneath the rubble. A thought suddenly struck Cian. Does that connect somehow to Tan? It's because Tan carries magic in him too. Hilda patiently explained that Tan's senses were far sharper than any human's. Likely just an instinct born of being an animal. Cian was a little surprised. So all I need to do is spend time playing with Tan? That's enough? Getting a confirming answer, she finally understood. But Cian quickly grew worried again. How is Tan doing now? Hilda said both Tan and the coffin had been inside the tower at the time. Even though the coffin had been moved to a different floor, its protective spell had kept it from any damage. Hearing the coffin was unharmed, Cian had just started to relax when Hilda's expression turned awkward. It wouldn't be quite right to say nothing had happened at all. The power Your Highness released upon awakening had actually affected Tan's soul. Shin was confused. Before she could even grasp what change her own power might have caused, a sound suddenly stirred behind her. She turned around on instinct. A silver-haired boy suddenly rushed toward her, catching Cian, who had only just woken, completely off guard. Flustered, she caught him in her arms, wondering who on earth this was. Looking closer, the child's silver hair looked exactly like Felix's. His deep blue eyes immediately brought Astrid to mind. Cian tried calling out, "Tan." The boy's laughter instantly grew brighter. Standing nearby, Hilda explained, a little awkwardly, "Your Highness's magic pulled Tan's soul back into his true body.